What if I told you the woman who built one of America's greatest libraries was secretly passing as white? That one of the richest women in New York at the turn of the century was a former prisoner accused of stealing nearly $30 million from her lover? That a black enslaved man outsmarted the British Empire and helped win the American Revolution? And that a Renaissance princess with African ancestry was literally painted out of history? These aren't conspiracy theories. They're real stories. Buried, erased, ignored. For generations, we were handed a version of history that felt complete, polished, patriotic, finished. It wasn't. Behind the Founding Fathers, behind Wall Street fortunes, behind royal dynasties, there were people whose names you were never meant to remember. Until now. Let me show you the stories they didn't teach you in school. Washington, D.C., 1879. In a city still scarred by the Civil War and trembling through Reconstruction, a child was born into what should have been certainty. Her name was Belle Marion Greener. She entered the world inside a household of achievement, the kind of household that symbolized progress. Her father, Richard T. Greener, had shattered one of America's hardest ceilings when he became the first African-American graduate of Harvard College in 1870. That single achievement made him a figure of national importance. He was brilliant, ambitious, relentless, a man who believed education could bend history. Her mother, Genevieve Fleet Greener, came from a respected, educated black family in Washington. She was a teacher, a musician, a woman who filled rooms with piano notes and intellectual conversation. The Greener home was not one of survival. It was one of aspiration. Books lined the walls. Political debates filled the air. Frederick Douglass was not just a distant icon. He was part of the same intellectual universe. These were people who believed that the arc of America could be pulled toward justice if enough educated minds pushed. Belle grew up surrounded by language, culture, refinement, but she also grew up surrounded by something else, fragility, because no matter how accomplished her father was, no matter how refined her mother appeared, in 19th century America, race was a ceiling you could never fully escape. The Greener children were light-skinned. That fact would matter more than anyone could predict. At first, Belle's childhood seemed stable. Richard's career was rising. He held positions in government offices. He moved in elite circles. The family was financially comfortable, unusually so for a black family at the time. Then came the rupture. One census return changed everything. Richard discovered that Genevieve had listed the family as white, not mulatto, not colored, white. To a man whose life's work centered on racial advancement and dignity, it was a betrayal of identity, not simply a bureaucratic detail, a denial of who they were. He had fought to elevate the standing of Black Americans. He had built his name around that truth, and now his own household was quietly stepping outside of it. The fracture between husband and wife widened quickly. They separated, though they never formally divorced. Richard eventually left the United States, taking a diplomatic position abroad. He would even begin another family overseas. But inside Washington, something irreversible had begun. The Greener children learned a new lesson. Survival in America could require reinvention. Subtle changes came first. The R in Greener quietly disappeared. Green, Belle dropped Marion. She would later adopt a middle name that sounded European, aristocratic, something Mediterranean, something that could explain a slightly darker complexion without invoking America's most dangerous label. Genevieve altered her maiden name to suggest Dutch ancestry. Small edits, soft shifts, no dramatic announcement, no public declaration, just the slow reshaping of identity. To understand this moment, you have to understand the era. The late 1800s were not forgiving. Jim Crow was tightening its grip. Social mobility for Black Americans was shrinking. not expanding. Passing the act of presenting oneself as white was both a strategy and a gamble. If discovered, it could mean social ruin. But if successful, it opened doors otherwise sealed shut. For Belle, still a child, the transformation was gradual. She was not yet consciously calculating the risks, but she absorbed the lesson. Names matter, appearance matters, information matters. Control the narrative or someone else will. She received an exceptional education at home, far beyond what most girls, black or white, were given. Her parents valued intellect fiercely. Literature, languages, history, music, these were not luxuries in the Greener household. They were expectations. And Belle excelled. She was observant, quick-witted, naturally organized. She developed a sharp eye for detail, the kind of mind that could see order inside chaos. Yet beneath the polish, a quiet tension lived inside her upbringing. Her father represented public, racial pride. Her mother was quietly rewriting the family's racial classification. Two survival philosophies under one roof. Belle would eventually choose one, but not yet. In 1896, she left Washington for Massachusetts to attend the Northfield Seminary for young ladies on scholarship. It was a prestigious environment, structured, disciplined, mostly white. Here, Belle perfected something far more powerful than academic skill. She perfected presentation. She learned how to enter a room without inviting questions, how to dress, how to speak, how to allow assumptions to form and never contradict them. She was not yet Belle da Costa Greene, but she was becoming someone new. The transition was not born of shame. It was born of calculation. In America, at the turn of the century, talent alone was not enough. Opportunity required access, and access required perception. If the world insisted on building gates, Belle would learn how to walk through them unnoticed. By the time she continued her studies in library science, a new and growing professional field, she understood something fundamental. Knowledge was power, but proximity to power was something else entirely. And Belle was no longer content to stand outside of it. She would not merely survive history. She would curate it. What no one in that Massachusetts classroom knew, what even many who later worked beside her would never know, was that the woman who would one day shape one of America's most prestigious cultural institutions had already rewritten the first chapter of her own life. The transformation had begun quietly in Washington. The world would soon meet the finished version, and they would never suspect what had been erased. Philadelphia, 1884. Before the scandal, before the headlines, before the millions, there was just a wedding. Hannah Elias was 19 years old when she made a decision that would fracture her life in two. Her sister Hattie was getting married, and the entire Elias family was determined to present themselves with dignity. They lived in one of the most respectable black neighborhoods in Philadelphia. Her father, Charles Elias, was a caterer of mixed African American and Native American heritage. He worked hard. The family was known. They were climbing slowly, steadily. Hannah had recently begun working in the home of a wealthy white woman. Domestic service, quiet labor, invisible presence. In that house hung a dress, elegant, expensive, the kind of fabric that shimmered under candlelight, the kind of dress that signaled status before a single word was spoken. Hannah borrowed it. Maybe she meant to return it. Maybe she didn't. What matters is that she wore it to the wedding, and when she entered the room, heads turned. One guest later described her as the belle of the evening. For a few hours, Hannah felt something intoxicating. Elevation. She wasn't the caterer's daughter. She wasn't the hired help. She wasn't limited. She was admired. But admiration is fragile. Days later, police arrived at the Elias home. Her employer had discovered the missing dress. There was no extended investigation, no nuanced hearing, In late 19th century America, a young black woman accused by a white employer did not receive the benefit of doubt. That same evening, Hannah stood before a judge, guilty, 4 months in Moyamensing prison. Just like that, the trajectory shifted. Inside prison, she shared space with roughly 40 other women. The rest of the facility housed men convicted of violent crimes. The air was heavy, the future narrower. When she was released, she tried to return home. Her father refused to let her stay. Respectability had been the family's shield. She had pierced it. Whether he acted from shame, fear, or disappointment, the result was the same. Hannah was alone. No money, no protection, no plan. She moved north to New York City. If Washington had taught Belle the art of reinvention through education, New York would teach Hannah reinvention through survival. The Tenderloin district in the 1880s pulsed with contradiction. Hotels, saloons, theaters, police raids, vice dens. It was a place where reputations dissolved and fortunes quietly formed. Hannah made another decision. She began selling the only asset she could control herself. Prostitution was not glamorous. It was unstable, dangerous. Arrests were common. Disease was common. Violence was common. In 1885, she became pregnant. In early 1886, she gave birth to a daughter, Clara. The child was placed for adoption. There is no record of reunion. Soon after, Hannah was arrested again, this time for prostitution, and sentenced to 1 month on Roosevelt Island. Another humiliation, another mark. But prison taught her something crucial. The system was rigid, but not airtight. Men with power had weaknesses. Desire bent rules. Money rewrote morality. Hannah adjusted. She refined her appearance. She claimed Cuban heritage when necessary, using her lighter skin tone to blur assumptions. She studied men, especially wealthy ones. And then, she met John R. Platt. He was in his mid-60s, a businessman who had built his wealth in plate glass. Married, respected, established. Their relationship began quietly in the late 1880s. Meetings arranged through coded newspaper advertisements, Bessie and Papa. Secret signals in plain sight. It could have remained an affair. Instead, it became an arrangement. Platt began giving her money, thousands of dollars per month. The equivalent today would reach into the 6 figures annually. But Hannah did something most would not expect. She invested. Under Platt's guidance, or perhaps through her own growing instincts, she bought property, rental houses in uptown Manhattan, real estate near Harlem before it became Harlem as we know it. The former prisoner began accumulating wealth, not cash in drawers, assets. By the early 1900s, Hannah Elias was living in a Manhattan townhouse and maintaining a beach house in Far Rockaway. She employed a maid, a butler, household staff, from prison inmate to millionaire in less than 2 decades. But New York whispers, and fortunes built in secrecy rarely stay hidden. In the summer of 1904, those whispers would explode into one of the biggest scandals the city had ever seen. Because when a wealthy white businessman decides he wants his money back, he does not accuse himself. He accuses the woman. And Hannah Elias was about to discover that, in America, reinvention can elevate you, but it can also make you a target. Virginia, mid-1700s, long before headlines, long before victory parades, before Yorktown, James was born into slavery. No celebration marked his arrival. No official record fixed his exact birth year. Somewhere between 1748 and 1760, on a plantation in New Kent County, Virginia, a child entered a world where his future was legally owned by another man. His master was William Armistead, who had inherited James from his father. The Armisteds were not among the cruelest of slaveholding families, but that distinction is relative. Bondage, even under kind ownership, is still bondage. Yet James's life contained an unusual detail. He was educated. In Virginia, unlike in some southern colonies, teaching enslaved people to read and write was not illegal. William and James grew up near the same age. They were raised within the same estate household. It appears James learned to read and write both English and French. This fact would change everything. Most enslaved men were denied literacy because knowledge creates agency. But James developed something rare: comprehension of language, awareness of politics, and an ability to observe quietly. By the time the American Revolution began simmering, Virginia was a powder keg. Colonists demanded liberty from Britain while continuing to hold human beings in chains. For a man like James, the contradiction was obvious. Freedom for whom? In 1775, the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, issued a proclamation. Any enslaved person who joined the British Army would be granted freedom. It was a powerful offer. Serve the crown, gain liberty. For James, the temptation was real. Freedom was not theoretical. It was tangible, immediate, legally protected under British authority. But there were complications. James had a wife, children. Leaving to join the British could mean permanent separation. And if the war shifted, if Britain lost, freedom might vanish as quickly as it was promised. Meanwhile, his master William supported the Patriot cause. He supplied livestock to the Continental Army. He believed in American independence. And so James faced an impossible calculation: join the British and secure personal freedom, or side with a revolution that preached liberty while denying his humanity. In 1781, opportunity arrived in the form of Marquis de Lafayette. The young French general had developed a fierce opposition to slavery. When he learned of James's intelligence and literacy, he saw something others overlooked: not a servant, an asset. Lafayette proposed something radical. James would pretend to defect to the British as a runaway slave. He would infiltrate enemy lines. He would gather intelligence. He would report back to the Continental Army. It was espionage, high risk, no safety net. If captured as a spy, James would be executed. No trial, no negotiation. And unlike white soldiers, he could carry no identification papers, proving his true allegiance. His protection depended entirely on deception. James agreed. There was no written promise of freedom from Lafayette, no contract guaranteeing reward, only trust. He crossed into British lines posing as a runaway, seeking refuge under Lord Dunmore's proclamation. British officers, eager to recruit enslaved men, accepted him. What they did not realize was that James was not fleeing. He was listening. He attended British meetings as a servant. He poured drinks. He moved through rooms unnoticed. He absorbed troop movements, supply routes, strategy discussions. Then the British made a decision that would seal their fate. They trusted him enough to send him into Patriot camps as a double agent, believing he would gather intelligence for them. Instead, James fed them false information while carrying accurate intelligence back to Lafayette. He gained the confidence of General Charles Cornwallis himself. Cornwallis underestimated him. Many British aristocrats considered black men intellectually inferior. That arrogance became James's greatest weapon. In August 1781, James learned of Cornwallis's plan to move troops from Portsmouth to Yorktown, expecting reinforcement by sea through the Chesapeake Bay. James passed the information to Lafayette. The French Navy blockaded the Chesapeake. Continental forces surrounded Yorktown. On the 19th of October 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. The British Empire's grip on America shattered. History remembers Washington, Hamilton, Lafayette. Few remember the enslaved man who stood quietly in British tents, memorizing secrets. But victory had not yet freed him. When the war ended, James returned to Virginia and remained a slave, because under Virginia law, only soldiers qualified for emancipation, and James had never formally carried a gun. 5 years would pass before Lafayette intervened directly, writing to the Virginia legislature, attesting to James's essential services. In 1787, James Armistead was finally granted freedom. He later added Lafayette to his name, the slave who outwitted an empire. But for years, after saving a revolution built on liberty, he had to ask for his own. Washington, D.C., late 1890s. Reinvention doesn't happen all at once. It happens in edits. A letter rewritten, a surname shortened, a silence maintained. By the time Belle left Washington for Massachusetts, she understood something fundamental about America. Identity was not just who you were, it was how you were perceived. And perception could be managed. The R in greener had already disappeared. Green felt lighter, cleaner, less traceable, but it wasn't enough. In elite academic and social circles, questions were subtle, but constant. Where is your family from? Your complexion Mediterranean? Portuguese, perhaps? Belle learned to answer without answering. She added something new. Da Costa. The name sounded European, Iberian, Old World. It implied lineage instead of struggle. It offered explanation without inviting scrutiny. Belle da Costa Greene. The transformation was strategic, not impulsive. At Northfield Seminary for Young Ladies, she refined more than her academic skills. She observed the codes of white society: posture, tone, fashion, restraint. She learned when to speak and when to let silence do the work. In classrooms filled mostly with white students, she was not confronted directly. Instead, she was absorbed, accepted, assumed, and she never corrected the assumption. After Northfield, she studied library science, an emerging professional field that demanded precision. Governments and universities were drowning in centuries of documents, manuscripts, and records that lacked order. Archivists were becoming essential. Belle excelled. Cataloging required pattern recognition, memory, discipline, but it also required something else: authority, the ability to impose structure on chaos and make others trust that structure. In 1902, she secured a position at Princeton University's library. It was prestigious, competitive, and overwhelmingly white. She thrived. Princeton was not just a workplace, it was proximity to power, wealthy donors, industrial heirs, men who would shape American finance and culture. Among them, Junius Spencer Morgan II. Junius was the nephew of J.P. Morgan, the titan of American banking. He visited Princeton frequently and supported its collections. He noticed Belle, her composure, her knowledge of rare books, her confidence in academic circles. Dominated by men, she did not shrink. She did not hesitate. She spoke with authority, and she never revealed the full story of her origin. By 1905, Junius recommended her to his uncle. At the time, J.P. Morgan's private collection was legendary and chaotic. Rare manuscripts, medieval texts, illuminated Bibles, Renaissance art, correspondence from monarchs, all stacked without coherent organization in a private building on Madison Avenue. Morgan wanted order. Belle wanted access. When she first entered the collection, she saw what others saw: disorder. But she also saw something more: opportunity. This was not simply a job. It was proximity to one of the most powerful men in the world. Morgan was 68. Belle was 26. Their first meetings were professional, focused, direct. Morgan tested her knowledge. She did not falter. She understood provenance. She understood market value. She understood rarity. And she understood how to speak to a man accustomed to obedience without appearing deferential. Morgan hired her. Just like that, Belle crossed a line most women, and certainly most women of color, could not approach. But with every door that opened, the stakes increased. Because now, the lie wasn't abstract. It was embedded in contracts, Invitations, introductions. Belle da Costa Greene, described as a woman of Portuguese descent, began shaping one of America's greatest cultural institutions. And the more indispensable she became, the more dangerous the truth would be. Her past remained silent. Her father was still alive, still known in Black intellectual circles, but Belle rarely saw him. Their worlds had diverged, one built around racial advocacy, the other built around selective erasure. In Morgan's library, Belle moved through rooms lined with priceless artifacts, but the most carefully curated artifact was herself. Every interaction required balance. Too much transparency risked collapse. Too much distance risked suspicion. But Belle possessed something rare: nerve. She did not behave like someone hiding. She behaved like someone who belonged. And in America, belonging is often awarded to those who act as though they already have it. Within months, Morgan trusted her judgment. Within years, he trusted her entirely. She screened collectors, negotiated purchases, determined which acquisitions were worth tens of thousands of dollars. Her salary rose to $10,000 a year, an extraordinary sum. Whispers began. Who was she? Really? How had she ascended so quickly? Was it intelligence? Charm? Something more intimate? Rumors about her relationship with Morgan circulated through New York society. She neither confirmed nor denied them. When asked directly years later whether she had been his mistress, she reportedly smiled and said, "We tried." Ambiguity was her shield. But behind the wit and elegance was constant calculation. If the truth emerged that Belle da Costa Greene was born Belle Marion Greener, the daughter of one of America's most prominent Black intellectuals, everything could unravel. Reputation, position, legacy. So she continued the performance, not as deception for deception's sake, but as survival at the highest level. In Washington, a census form had split her family. In New York, her name would build an empire, and she would guard that name fiercely, because now she wasn't just passing, she was indispensable. New York City, late 1880s. In Tenderloin, survival had rules. You learned them fast, or you disappeared. After her release from Roosevelt Island, Hannah Elias understood one thing with painful clarity. Poverty was more dangerous than scandal. Prison had not broken her. Rejection had hardened her. When her father refused to let her return home, the final thread tying her to respectability snapped. In New York, no one asked about Philadelphia. No one asked about Moyamensing Prison. They asked different questions. Where are you from? What's your story? And Hannah discovered something powerful. People believed what made them comfortable. Her complexion was light, ambiguous. She leaned into it. I'm Cuban. The claim wasn't outrageous. New York was filling with immigrants, Italians, Irish, Jews from Eastern Europe, Spaniards, Caribbean arrivals. Ethnic complexity blurred the lines. Being foreign was exotic. Being Black was limiting. So she let men assume. She refined her wardrobe, silk instead of cotton, gloves, hats angled just right. She softened her accent, lowered her voice, listened more than she spoke. Tenderloin was a marketplace, and Hannah was no longer selling desperation. She was selling illusion. She began attracting wealthier clients, businessmen, property owners, politicians who needed discretion. The coded newspaper ads Bessie and Papa allowed secret meetings in plain sight. It was primitive encryption in a world before telephones were common in private homes. Then came John R. Platt. Platt was not reckless. He was methodical. A self-made man who had accumulated wealth in the plate glass industry. He was in his 60s, married, and respected in Manhattan business circles. At first, their meetings were transactional. Then, they became habitual. Platt valued two things above all: privacy and control. Hannah gave him both. Unlike others in the district, she did not gossip. She did not threaten. She did not dramatize. She listened. She flattered carefully. She made him feel essential. And slowly, the arrangement shifted. Platt began giving her money far beyond what would be considered typical compensation. Thousands of dollars a month. Not as random gifts, as support. But here is where Hannah separated herself from stereotype. She did not spend recklessly. She invested. Platt, perhaps proud of his own business acumen, advised her on property. Real estate north of Central Park was inexpensive. Harlem had not yet transformed into its cultural future. It was still in transition, a gamble. Hannah bought rental houses, boarding properties, structures near established neighborhoods, but just far enough away to be affordable. The former prisoner from Philadelphia began building an asset base. By the early 1890s, she had enough revenue from tenants to reduce reliance on Platt's direct payments. She diversified stocks, additional property. Her transformation was almost surgical. The woman once sentenced for stealing a dress was now hosting guests in a Manhattan townhouse. And yet, wealth brought risk. In 1895, an incident exposed the fragility of secrecy. Platt visited one of her rental properties under an alias Mr. Greene. A tenant, Cornelius Williams, answered the door and later became suspicious. Weeks later, Hannah evicted him. He blamed the mysterious Mr. Greene. Years later, in a tragic twist, Williams would murder Andrew Haswell Greene, a prominent New Yorker, mistakenly believing he was Platt. Hannah was not directly responsible, but proximity to secrecy had consequences. Still, her fortune grew. She purchased a beach house in Far Rockaway, maintained staff, a maid, a butler, domestic help. She lived in visible comfort, silk curtains, imported furnishings, crystal decanters catching afternoon light. Newspapers began whispering. Who was this woman? How had she accumulated so much so quickly? Rumors floated: inheritance, foreign aristocracy, secret benefactors. Hannah said little. By the early 1900s, she may have been one of the wealthiest black women in America. And that fact alone was destabilizing, because in Gilded Age New York, wealth was power, but race still defined boundaries. Platt's wife died. He grew older, perhaps uneasy, perhaps fearful of what his family would discover. Fortunes given quietly often breed regret loudly. In the summer of 1904, Platt did something that would detonate both their lives. He filed a lawsuit. He accused Hannah Elias of extorting $685,000 from him, a sum equivalent to roughly $30 million today. Suddenly, the woman who had mastered reinvention was dragged into headlines. Police raided her townhouse. She was arrested and taken to the Tombs, a grim Manhattan prison known for its harsh conditions. The press devoured the story, not just because of the money, but because of her. Newspapers fixated on her race. Was she black, foreign, Cuban, a manipulative temptress, a criminal mastermind? The narrative shifted overnight, from mysterious millionaire to alleged blackmailer, and Hannah discovered something brutal about American power. Men could fund your rise, but they could also attempt to erase you. The question now wasn't whether she could survive Tenderloin. It was whether she could survive exposure. Virginia, 1781. War had turned the colonies into a chessboard. Armies marched. Generals strategized. Flags rose and fell. And moving quietly between them was a man most officers barely noticed. James. When he crossed into British lines posing as a runaway slave, he carried no weapon, no documents, no guarantee. His value depended entirely on his performance. To the British, he was useful labor, a black man seeking protection under Lord Dunmore's promise of freedom. They saw what they expected to see: a servant, a tool, a man beneath suspicion. That miscalculation became their weakness. James was assigned to assist officers, move through camps, deliver messages. He cleaned, poured drinks, stood silently near strategy discussions. He absorbed everything: troop numbers, supply shortages, movement schedules, invasions, command tensions. And then the British made a decision that would define the war. They sent him back into American lines as a supposed double agent. From their perspective, it was brilliant. A literate enslaved man who could move unnoticed among Patriot forces. Someone who could bring back detailed intelligence. James returned and delivered everything he had learned to Marquis de Lafayette. Then Lafayette and the Continental officers gave him something in return: false information. James walked back into British headquarters carrying lies wrapped in credibility. He exaggerated American weaknesses, misstated troop positions, delayed reports. He became a controlled leak. General Charles Cornwallis, aristocratic and confident, trusted him. Cornwallis had served the crown for decades. He had defeated American forces before. He believed in structure, hierarchy, and in racial assumptions that told him men like James were incapable of strategic deception. James understood that. He never overplayed his hand, never acted clever, never stepped outside the role. Invisibility became his camouflage. In August 1781, James overheard something critical. Cornwallis planned to move his troops from Portsmouth to Yorktown. The location was strategic, close to the Chesapeake Bay, where British naval reinforcements could arrive. With supplies secured by sea, Cornwallis believed he could fortify his position and crush the rebels. He believed secrecy protected him. James memorized the details. He slipped back to American lines and delivered the intelligence to Lafayette. The response was swift. The French Navy sailed to blockade the Chesapeake. Without naval support, Cornwallis's position at Yorktown became a trap rather than a fortress. Continental forces advanced by land. Trenches were dug within striking distance. Artillery bombarded British defenses day after day. On the 19th of October, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. The image of British soldiers laying down arms would become iconic, but behind that moment stood information. Information gathered by a man no one considered powerful. There is an account, possibly apocryphal but widely repeated, that Cornwallis later encountered James in American uniform and remarked, "Ah, you rogue, then you have been playing me a trick all this time." If true, it was an understatement. James had not merely tricked him, he had shifted the war. Yorktown did not immediately end the revolution, but it destroyed British momentum. The Crown's political will faltered. Negotiations accelerated. The Treaty of Paris would follow in 1783. Independence had been secured. And yet, when the celebrations faded, James returned home not as a decorated hero but as property. Virginia law recognized military service as grounds for emancipation, but James had not served formally as a soldier. He had rarely carried a weapon. His work was classified under no clear category. Espionage did not fit neatly into statutes. So, despite risking execution, despite altering the course of a global conflict, James remained enslaved. For 5 years, William Armistead, his master, supported his petition for freedom. Lafayette wrote directly to the Virginia legislature, praising James's essential services. Without that intervention, it is possible James would have died in bondage. In 1787, the legislature granted his manumission. William was compensated for the loss of his slave. James added Lafayette to his name in honor of the general who had believed in him. Freedom came, but not immediately, not automatically, not gratefully. It had to be requested, approved, documented. The irony was impossible to ignore. A nation founded on liberty required paperwork to acknowledge the humanity of the man who helped secure it. James Armistead Lafayette would later own land, raise a family, even in a reflection of his time's moral contradictions, owned slaves himself. History is rarely clean, but this remains undeniable. An enslaved man, armed only with literacy and nerve, penetrated the command structure of the British Empire and helped bring it down. Yet, even in victory, he had to prove he deserved to be free. And that tension between rhetoric and reality would echo through American history long after the cannons at Yorktown fell silent. New York City, 1905. By the time Belle da Costa Greene walked into J.P. Morgan's private library on Madison Avenue, she understood something most people never do. Access is everything. The building itself did not yet carry the weight of the institution it would become. It was private, exclusive, a fortress of wealth disguised as culture. Inside were medieval manuscripts, Renaissance drawings, rare Bibles, letters from monarchs stacked, stored, admired, but not truly organized. It was a treasure vault without a map. Morgan needed order. Belle needed permanence. When Junius Spencer Morgan II recommended her to his uncle, it was not charity, it was strategy. Morgan was meticulous about talent. He demanded competence. He expected precision, and Belle delivered both. Their first meetings were professional, almost surgical. Morgan questioned her knowledge of provenance. She answered without hesitation. He challenged her valuation instincts. She responded with facts. He tested her memory. She did not stumble. What Morgan valued, above all, was control. And Belle offered him something rare, someone who could manage chaos without threatening his authority. At 26, she was young. At 68, he was a titan. The age gap alone fueled curiosity in New York society. But what mattered inside those library walls was competence. Belle began cataloging the collection by theme, era, origin. She imposed classification systems. She created accessibility where there had been only accumulation. For the first time, Morgan could locate specific treasures without excavation. That efficiency impressed him, but Belle's role expanded quickly. As Morgan's reputation as a collector grew, so did the requests. Artists seeking funding, scholars requesting access, dealers offering rare acquisitions. The flow of petitions became overwhelming. Belle became the gatekeeper. Every proposal passed through her hands first. She screened, evaluated, rejected most, recommended few. Morgan trusted her judgment, and trust, in that circle, was currency. Her salary rose to $10,000 per year, an extraordinary figure for a librarian, especially a woman. In modern terms, it equated to hundreds of thousands of dollars. People noticed. Who was she? Where had she come from? Whispers about her background surfaced in drawing rooms and salons. Her complexion, her name, her independence, they fueled speculation. Some assumed she was European. Others assumed an exotic lineage. Belle never clarified. Ambiguity worked in her favor. She dressed boldly, large feathered hats, tailored gowns. She smoked. She drank. She laughed loudly in elite company. She refused to embody the stereotype of the quiet, retiring librarian. She once remarked that being a librarian did not mean one had to be dull. And then there were the rumors. Morgan had a reputation for extramarital relationships. Belle was constantly at his side, traveling, negotiating, organizing his personal intellectual empire. Their closeness sparked suspicion. When later asked if she had been his mistress, her answer, "We tried," only deepened the mystery. Whether romantic or purely professional, their relationship was undeniable in one respect. Morgan relied on her. When he died in 1913, he left her $50,000 in his will. That gesture spoke volumes. After his death, many assumed Belle's influence would fade. Instead, it expanded. J. P. Morgan Jr. retained her. She continued shaping acquisitions, Traveling internationally to attend auctions and secure rare manuscripts, she developed a particular passion for medieval illuminated texts. Under her guidance, the collection became one of the finest in the world. But the higher she rose, the thinner the margin for error became. Belle da Costa Greene was now a public figure within elite cultural circles. Her presence at auctions in Europe was noted. Her bids were aggressive, her confidence unwavering, and yet, beneath the authority, was constant vigilance. If her true origins surfaced, if anyone connected her to Richard T. Greener, the prominent black intellectual, the consequences could be devastating. Her position was built on perception, and perception, in early 20th century America, was unforgiving. But Belle did not behave like someone hiding. She behaved like someone indispensable. By the 1910s, it was clear that she was no longer merely Morgan's librarian. She was managing the future of the institution, deciding its direction, shaping its identity. When the Morgan Library officially opened to the public in 1924, Belle became its first director. From private vault to public museum, and at the center of that transformation stood a woman who had rewritten her own identity before she ever reorganized Morgan's collection. In Washington, she had learned survival. In Princeton, she had learned proximity. In New York, she mastered power. The lie she carried was not fragile. It was fortified by success. And the more irreplaceable she became, the more impossible it was for the truth to surface. Because by then, Belle da Costa Greene was no longer just passing. She was defining culture itself. New York City, summer, 1904. When John R. Platt filed his complaint, he did not whisper. He detonated. The accusation was staggering. Hannah Elias had extorted $685,000 from him. Over the years, a sum that would equal roughly $30 million today. The number alone guaranteed headlines, but the story had gasoline poured on it for another reason. A wealthy, elderly, white businessman, a mysterious black woman with foreign heirs, a secret affair, a fortune transferred in silence. It was irresistible to the press. Police descended on Hannah's Manhattan townhouse. Officers searched drawers, seized letters, examined financial records. Servants watched in shock as the illusion of privacy collapsed. Hannah was arrested and taken to the Tombs, the grim prison in Lower Manhattan, known for its cold stone walls and suffocating cells. For days, newspapers ran breathless updates. Was she a seductress, a manipulator, a criminal mastermind who had drained an old man's fortune? Platt's narrative was carefully constructed. He claimed their relationship began innocently, a visit for medical relief, perhaps rheumatism. He insisted he had supported her financially out of generosity. Then, according to him, she began blackmailing him. If he stopped paying, she would expose the affair. It was a convenient story. It framed him as victim. It framed her as predator. But investigators ran into a problem. There was no evidence of extortion, no threatening letters, no recorded demands, no proof of coercion. What they found instead were consistent, voluntary transfers of money over many years. Platt had not been drained. He had funded her willingly. After several tense days in custody, Hannah was released. Charges were dropped, but the damage was done. Her name was everywhere. Newspapers obsessed, not only over the money but over her racial background. Was she black, Cuban, mixed, foreign-born? Reporters speculated wildly. In an era when immigration was reshaping New York, xenophobia and racism blended easily. Some papers painted her as an exotic outsider who had swindled a vulnerable man. Others framed her as a calculating opportunist who exploited weakness. Few acknowledged the possibility that she had simply been in a consensual, long-term relationship with a powerful man who later regretted his generosity. The truth began to surface quietly. The real pressure had not come from Platt himself, but from his family. When they discovered how much of their anticipated inheritance had been transferred to Hannah, panic erupted. What should have been theirs was gone, so they pushed him to act. After the criminal case collapsed, the family filed a civil suit, attempting to recover the money through the courts. Again, the effort failed. Judges found no basis for restitution. The payments had been voluntary. The relationship, however morally judged by society, did not constitute a crime. By early 1905, the legal storm subsided. Hannah remained wealthy, but something fundamental had shifted. Before the lawsuit, she was a private mystery. After it, she was infamous. Infamy brings attention. Attention brings scrutiny, and scrutiny erodes comfort. Though legally vindicated, Hannah's social position was unstable. Invitations dwindled. Trust thinned. Gossip persisted. John R. Platt died in 1908. His estate, once formidable, was surprisingly modest compared to the sums he had given Hannah. She received nothing in his will. She did not attend the funeral. She did not need to. She already possessed what had been transferred. In the 1910s, as Harlem began transforming into a center of Black culture and economic growth, Hannah remained involved in property transactions. Ironically, the neighborhood she had invested in years earlier would become synonymous with African American advancement. Yet she did not become a visible patron of that movement. Perhaps the scandal had exhausted her. Perhaps visibility now felt dangerous. By 1923, nearly 2 decades after the explosive lawsuit, Hannah made another decisive move. She left America. Accompanied by her Japanese butler, Kato, she boarded a ship bound for Europe. No farewell statement, no public explanation, just departure. Some accounts claim she settled in Paris. Others suggest the French Riviera. Records grow thin. Dates blur. The woman who had once dominated New York headlines faded into ambiguity. It was a fitting final act for someone who had built her life on reinvention. From prisoner to millionaire, from anonymity to scandal, from Harlem to Europe, Hannah Elias understood something brutal and timeless about power in America. You can rise through its cracks. You can accumulate within its blind spots, but once the spotlight turns on you, survival requires movement. And she moved one last time into the margins of history. Virginia, 1783. The war was over. Cannons had gone silent. The Treaty of Paris would soon formalize what Yorktown had made inevitable. The United States of America had secured independence. Men who had carried muskets returned home as veterans. James returned home as property. There were no parades waiting for him in New Kent County. No public acknowledgement that he had infiltrated British headquarters. No recognition that his intelligence had helped trap Cornwallis at Yorktown. He went back to William Armistead's plantation. Back to work. The irony was brutal. The revolution had been fought under the language of liberty. All men are created equal. Yet equality was not universal. Freedom, in practice, was selective. Virginia law had a clause that complicated everything. Slave owners could not simply free enslaved people at will unless those individuals had performed meritorious services recognized by the state. In 1782, legislation allowed enslaved men who served as soldiers in the Revolutionary War to claim freedom. But James had not technically served as a soldier. He had not marched in uniform. He had not stood in formation. He had rarely carried a weapon. He had been a spy. And espionage did not fit neatly into legal language. So, despite risking execution if exposed, despite directly influencing a decisive military victory, James remained enslaved. Years passed. William Armistead supported James's petition for emancipation. He was not resisting, he was advocating. But even a supportive master was subject to state approval. The bureaucracy moved slowly. Meanwhile, James continued laboring. Imagine the psychological tension to have shaped history and then return to daily servitude. To know that Cornwallis had once trusted you, that Lafayette had depended on you, and yet legally you remained owned. Freedom was close enough to taste, but not granted. The breakthrough came through the only channel powerful enough to override inertia, the Marquis de Lafayette, who had admired James's intelligence and courage, refused to let his contribution be forgotten. In 1784, he wrote directly to the Virginia legislature, testifying to James's essential services. His words carried weight. This was not an obscure endorsement. It was a declaration from one of the most celebrated generals of the Revolution. Pressure mounted. In January 1787, 5 years after Yorktown, the Virginia governor signed the petition granting James his freedom. The state compensated William Armistead for the loss of his slave. James was legally free. He chose to honor the man who had advocated for him by adding a new surname, James Armistead Lafayette. The name symbolized loyalty, gratitude, and perhaps something deeper acknowledgement that without intervention from powerful allies, justice can stall indefinitely. Freedom did not make him wealthy overnight. He settled in eastern Virginia, acquired land, farmed, and built a life with his wife and children. Over time, he prospered modestly. Records suggest he eventually owned property substantial enough to qualify for a pension based on his war service. In 1824, Lafayette returned to the United States for a grand tour. When the aging French hero visited Yorktown, James reunited with him. It was a meeting layered with symbolism. One man, born into European nobility, one man, born into American slavery, bound by a shared act of defiance against empire. James lived until 1832, dying at approximately 72 years old. His burial site remains uncertain, but his legacy carries complexity. Despite having been enslaved, James later owned slaves himself. To modern observers, that fact is jarring. How could a man who fought for liberty participate in the same system that had confined him? The answer lies in the era. 18th and early 19th century Virginia was economically structured around slavery. Land ownership and labor systems were intertwined. Many who experienced injustice still operated within the norms of their time. History resists simplicity. James was not a flawless hero. He was a man shaped by contradiction. But one truth stands firm. An enslaved black man infiltrated the command structure of the British Empire. He manipulated assumptions about race. He transmitted intelligence that helped secure American independence. And when victory came, he had to petition for the freedom that the Revolution claimed to defend. His life exposes a tension embedded in the nation's founding, the distance between principle and practice. In the shadows of Yorktown's triumph stood James Armistead Lafayette, invisible to most, indispensable to history, and proof that sometimes the most decisive power moves unseen. New York City, 1910s. By the second decade of the 20th century, Belle da Costa Greene was no longer simply organizing J.P. Morgan's collection. She was shaping cultural history. After Morgan's death in 1913, many expected her influence to shrink. Powerful men often replaced the people closest to their predecessors, especially women without a visible pedigree. Instead, the opposite happened. J.P. Morgan Jr. retained her not as a relic of his father's era, but as an authority in her own right. By then, Belle had proven something more valuable than loyalty: discernment. She had an eye. At European auctions, dealers quickly learned who she was. Belle did not attend quietly. She bid decisively. She knew market values down to the dollar. She could identify forged provenance. She understood which manuscripts would appreciate in both financial and scholarly worth, and she was fearless. When she wanted something, she did not hesitate. One of her most celebrated acquisitions came in 1911, an early, richly illustrated copy of Le Morte d'Arthur. The price was astronomical for the time, $50,000. Many would have considered it excessive. Belle did not. She recognized rarity when she saw it. Under her direction, the Morgan collection expanded dramatically in medieval illuminated manuscripts, Renaissance art, and pre-colonial African and Asian works. Her taste shaped the institution's identity, but the more she moved in elite international circles, the more extraordinary her position became. She was a woman. She was leading negotiations with aristocrats and scholars. She was controlling millions of dollars in acquisitions, and she was doing so while guarding a secret that could shatter everything. In private correspondence, Belle occasionally hinted at exhaustion. Maintaining composure in every room required vigilance, a slip of biographical detail, a stray question about her family, a chance encounter with someone from Washington who knew Richard T. Greener. The lie was not elaborate, but it was constant. Yet outwardly, she thrived. She cut a striking figure in New York society. Large feathered hats, silk gowns, cigarette in hand, a drink at social gatherings during the Roaring Twenties. She refused to embody the quiet, conservative stereotype expected of librarians. "I see no reason," she once remarked, "why a librarian should be dull." Her independence extended beyond style. She never married. In that era, marriage often meant career surrender. Belle chose her work. Though she maintained a long relationship with art expert Bernard Berenson, she never allowed domestic expectations to eclipse her authority. Her mother lived with her for much of her life. The woman who had once altered census records now occupied a quieter existence under Belle's carefully constructed identity. In 1924, the Morgan Library officially opened to the public as a fully accessible institution. It was no longer merely a private collector's vault, it was a cultural landmark, and Belle became its first official director. The symbolism was profound. A woman passing as white, overseeing one of the most prestigious cultural institutions in America. Visitors could only enter in small numbers at first. The rooms were intimate, heavy with carved wood and stained glass. But over time, expansions followed. Annexes were built, collections grew. By the end of her tenure, the institution housed thousands of rare manuscripts and artworks, along with hundreds of thousands of printed volumes. Belle had transformed chaos into legacy. But beneath the accomplishments lingered an unspoken tension. The Harlem Renaissance was unfolding uptown, a flourishing of Black art, literature, and intellectual identity. Writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston were redefining cultural narratives, and yet, one of the most powerful cultural figures in New York, a woman born into Black intellectual heritage, stood at the helm of a major institution without publicly acknowledging that lineage. Was it self-preservation, pragmatism, fear? Perhaps all three. Belle understood the era's limits. Her position existed because she was perceived as white. If that perception fractured, so might the institution's trust in her. So she continued the performance. Not nervously, not apologetically, confidently. She curated manuscripts about kings, saints, and revolutions. She negotiated with European dealers who never suspected her ancestry. She became indispensable, and in doing so, she cemented a paradox. A woman whose identity had been edited out of her own life was now responsible for preserving the documented identities of centuries past. History trusted her, even if it did not fully know her. And for Belle da Costa Greene, that may have been the ultimate victory to control narrative without being controlled by it. But secrets age, and even the most carefully curated lives leave traces. New York City, 1,905 1,923. The courtroom doors had closed. The charges had collapsed. The newspapers had moved on. But scandal leaves residue. Even though Hannah Elias had been legally cleared, her name was now permanently attached to one of the most sensational financial accusations in New York history. The woman, once known privately in elite circles, was now public spectacle. Invitations slowed. Conversations shifted tone. Curiosity became calculation. Yet her wealth remained intact. The properties she had purchased years earlier, especially those in Upper Manhattan, were increasing in value. Harlem was changing. What had once been transitional land was evolving into a cultural and economic center for African Americans migrating north. Hannah had invested before the transformation. Whether by instinct, guidance, or sheer timing, she had positioned herself advantageously. Rental income continued flowing. Tenants paid monthly. Properties appreciated. Her townhouse remained furnished. Staff remained employed. But something inside her seemed to pivot. The lawsuit had revealed a harsh truth. Power protects itself. John R. Platt had not been destroyed by the accusation. He had suffered embarrassment, certainly, but his reputation, bolstered by race, status, and age, endured more gently than hers. Hannah understood this. The American public was willing to believe that a black woman could manipulate a white industrialist. They were less willing to accept that a wealthy white man might have willingly transferred enormous sums to a woman he desired. The narrative defaulted to suspicion of her. Even victory in court did not erase that framing. Platt died in 1908. His estate, once thought vast, was modest compared to the money he had given Hannah. She did not appear publicly connected to his passing. No statement, no attendance at the funeral. The relationship that had once structured her rise dissolved into silence. During the 1910s, as Harlem blossomed with black entrepreneurship and culture, Hannah remained largely detached from public civic life. There are no records of her funding schools, sponsoring artists, or joining emerging intellectual movements. Perhaps she preferred invisibility, or perhaps, after the trial, visibility felt like vulnerability. New York society can elevate quickly and ostracize just as swiftly. The 1920s arrived with jazz, prohibition, and social upheaval. The city grew louder, faster, but Hannah's public presence diminished. Then, in 1923, she made a decisive move. She left the United States. Accompanied by her Japanese butler, Kato, she boarded a ship bound for Europe. The departure was quiet. No grand farewell. No legal disputes trailing her exit. Just movement. Why leave? Speculation varies. Lingering stigma. Potential civil claims. A desire for reinvention once more. Europe, particularly France, offered a different racial climate than America at the time. Paris, in the 1920s, attracted black expatriates, artists, and intellectuals seeking freedom from American racial constraints. It is possible Hannah saw opportunity again, not in property this time, but in anonymity. After her departure, records thinned dramatically. Some accounts suggest she settled in Paris. Others claim she lived along the French Riviera. A few state she died in relative comfort in the late 1920s. The ambiguity is striking. A woman who once dominated headlines with a $685,000 scandal faded into obscurity without official confirmation of her final days. No dramatic obituary, no public reckoning, no memoir correcting the record. She simply disappeared. Perhaps that was intentional. Hannah Elias had lived multiple lives. Philadelphia daughter, prison inmate, tenderloin prostitute, millionaire property owner, defendant in a national scandal, expatriate. Each identity required adaptation. Each phase demanded calculation. What remains undeniable is her trajectory. From a 4-month prison sentence over a borrowed dress to control of assets equivalent to tens of millions in modern value, she exploited the blind spots of a system that underestimated her. She used racial ambiguity as leverage, She invested strategically in land others dismissed, and when exposure threatened her stability, she relocated. Hannah understood something fundamental about American society in the Gilded Age. Power was uneven, reputation was fragile, and survival required movement. Her story does not end with triumphant redemption or tragic downfall. It ends with departure, which may be the most telling conclusion of all, because sometimes the most radical act in a society that seeks to define you is to refuse to remain where it can watch you. And Hannah Elias refused. She left with her wealth intact and her final chapter unwritten. Virginia, late 1780s, 1832. Freedom did not arrive with fireworks. It arrived with a signature. In January 1787, after years of petitioning, testimony, and legislative delay, the governor of Virginia approved James's manumission. The document was formal, bureaucratic, almost clinical in tone. No mention of Yorktown's smoke, no description of British strategy rooms, no acknowledgement of the risk of execution, just permission. The state compensated William Armistead for the loss of his slave. A financial transaction closed the legal gap between bondage and liberty. James stepped into freedom not as a celebrated war hero, but as a man catching up to a promise delayed. He chose a new name, James Armistead Lafayette. It was more than tribute, it was declaration. He attached himself permanently to the general who had recognized his intelligence when others saw only servitude. Freedom in post-revolution Virginia was complex. The new nation was forming its identity, but slavery remained embedded in its economic structure. Free black men occupied an uneasy space, legally independent, socially restricted. James did not move north. He did not flee the region of his enslavement. Instead, he remained in eastern Virginia, near New Kent County, building a life on land he acquired. He farmed, he raised crops, he supported his wife and children. Records indicate he eventually accumulated enough property to qualify for a military pension based on his wartime service. The government, slow to recognize him, eventually acknowledged his contribution with modest compensation. In 1824, more than 4 decades after Yorktown, Marquis de Lafayette returned to the United States for a triumphant tour. The aging French hero was welcomed with parades, speeches, public gratitude. When Lafayette visited Virginia and stood again on the soil of Yorktown, James came to see him. Imagine the reunion. 2 men bound by secrecy in 1781, one born into European nobility, the other into American slavery, meeting as old men. Lafayette reportedly recognized him. There was no spectacle surrounding James, no public monument raised in that moment, but the recognition mattered. He had not been forgotten by the man who knew the truth. James lived quietly for years afterward. By the time of his death in 1832, he had achieved a level of stability that many formerly enslaved individuals could not. He owned land, a marker of autonomy in early America, yet history rarely allows uncomplicated endings. Records show that James owned slaves himself. To modern readers, the fact jars sharply. How could a man who experienced bondage perpetuate it? The answer lies not in simple moral categories, but in context. Virginia's agricultural economy relied on enslaved labor. Property ownership and productivity were intertwined. For many landowners, white and black participation in the system was considered normative. This does not erase contradiction, it exposes it. James's life reflects the paradox embedded in the American founding, a revolution built on liberty coexisting with slavery. A man who risked death for independence yet had to petition for his own freedom. A freed slave who later adopted the practices of his era's economic structure. He was neither mythic hero nor villain. He was human. His burial site remains uncertain. No grand monument marks his grave. Historical markers exist, but they are modest compared to the statues erected for generals and statesmen. Yet, his contribution remains undeniable. Without his intelligence, Cornwallis's relocation to Yorktown might have succeeded unchallenged. Without that intelligence, the French blockade might have been delayed. Without Yorktown, negotiations could have stretched longer, costlier, bloodier. James operated in shadows. He weaponized invisibility. He understood how assumptions about race could be turned into strategic advantage. In British camps, he listened, while others dismissed him. He carried no sword, led no battalion, drafted no declaration, but he shifted momentum. And when the revolution ended, his life exposed the tension between rhetoric and reality more clearly than any speech could. Liberty was proclaimed, but liberty required documentation for him. James Armistead Lafayette's story does not offer easy inspiration. It offers complexity. It reminds us that revolutions are imperfect, that justice often trails behind victory, that heroes can live in contradiction. He died in 1832, at approximately 72 years old, having lived through enslavement, espionage, emancipation, and early nationhood. He began life invisible. He ended it free. And in between, he altered the course of history, not by commanding armies, but by understanding that sometimes the most powerful position in a room is the one no one notices. New York City, 1920s, 1940s. By the time the Morgan Library opened fully to the public in 1924, Belle da Costa Greene had achieved something extraordinary. She was no longer the young woman hired to organize chaos. She was the architect of legacy. The transition from private collection to public institution required more than cataloging skills. It required vision. The Morgan family name was already synonymous with finance and industry. Belle ensured it would also be synonymous with culture. She curated exhibitions. She expanded acquisitions. She shaped not only what was preserved, but what was displayed. Visitors entering the Morgan Library did not simply see books. They saw civilization arranged deliberately. Medieval manuscripts glowing with gold leaf, Renaissance drawings pinned beneath glass, letters penned by monarchs and thinkers centuries earlier. Belle determined what stories would be told through objects. She traveled frequently to Europe, especially during periods when economic instability made rare items available. The aftermath of World War I disrupted aristocratic fortunes. Noble families quietly sold heirlooms to survive. Belle recognized opportunity in upheaval. Where others saw decline, she saw preservation. She negotiated fiercely at auctions, earning a reputation as both formidable and disciplined. Dealers respected her, competitors feared her, and she never overpaid. Her authority within the institution was complete. Though she officially received the title of director in the 1920s, she had long been operating as one. Staff reported to her, collectors deferred to her judgment. She controlled millions in acquisitions in an era when few women controlled anything at that scale. New York society noticed. Belle became a recognizable figure at cultural gatherings. She entertained, smoked openly, dressed boldly. She cultivated mystique. But beneath the glamour was relentless discipline. She reviewed catalogs late into the night, corresponded with European scholars, maintained meticulous records. Her command of details was surgical, and still the secret endured. Throughout the Harlem Renaissance, while Black writers and artists claimed cultural space openly, Belle maintained distance. The irony was sharp. She had grown up among Black intellectuals in Washington, D.C., yet her public persona existed entirely within white elite circles. Did she feel tension? No surviving personal diaries answer that clearly. Many of her private papers were destroyed before her death. That act, deliberate and final, ensured that parts of her internal world would remain inaccessible. Perhaps that was intentional. As decades passed, She became inseparable from the Morgan Library itself. The institution's prestige reflected her decisions. Scholars consulted collections she had chosen. Exhibitions bore her imprint. When she retired in 1948, she had served more than 40 years shaping one of America's most important cultural institutions. An exhibition was held to honor her acquisitions, a retrospective of her impact, but age and illness had taken hold. She attended in a wheelchair. The image was striking. The woman who had stood confidently in auction halls across Europe, now frail, observing the legacy she had constructed. In 1950, Belle da Costa Greene died of cancer at St. Luke's Hospital in New York. She was 70 years old. The New York Times published an obituary, praising her as one of the most distinguished librarians in the country. It did not mention that she was born Belle Marion Greener. It did not mention Richard T. Greener. It did not mention the decision made decades earlier on a census form. Her secret largely survived her. Only later would historians piece together the truth that the woman who curated European aristocratic manuscripts had herself navigated one of America's most rigid racial barriers through calculated reinvention. Her life raises uncomfortable questions. Was her passing a betrayal of heritage or an act of survival within a system designed to exclude her? Perhaps both. Belle da Costa Greene controlled how history was preserved. She ensured priceless artifacts endured centuries, but she curated her own identity just as carefully. She understood narrative power, that what is documented becomes truth, and what is omitted fades. In the Morgan Library, glass cases protect fragile manuscripts from time. Belle protected her secret the same way, with precision, with intention, with silence. And even today, as visitors walk through the halls she shaped, many never realize that the institution's intellectual foundation was built by a woman who mastered America's most dangerous art, rewriting her own story before anyone else could. Europe, 1923, and after. When Hannah Elias stepped onto that ship in 1923, she was not fleeing poverty. She was leaving with wealth. That distinction matters. For decades, American society had tried to define her criminal, seductress, opportunist, foreigner, manipulator. The headlines had framed her story through suspicion rather than strategy. But by the time she sailed for Europe, she had already proven something quietly radical. She had beaten the system at its own game. In the aftermath of the 1904 scandal, Hannah could have retreated into obscurity within New York. She could have remained in Harlem, collected rent, and lived discreetly. Instead, she chose reinvention again. Europe in the 1920s offered something America did not: fluidity. Paris, in particular, had become a magnet for Black expatriates, artists, and intellectuals seeking relief from rigid American racial hierarchies. Musicians, writers, and performers found audiences who saw them first as talent, not as threat. It is unclear whether Hannah actively participated in expatriate cultural circles. Records of her life in France are scarce. Some accounts suggest she lived in comfort in Paris. Others place her along the French Riviera. What is consistent is this: she did not return to America. Her final years unfolded outside the country that had both elevated and humiliated her. There were no public apologies from newspapers that sensationalized her trial. No cultural reassessment acknowledging her financial intelligence. No memoir from her perspective. Her narrative ended in silence, but silence can be strategic. Consider the arc. At 19, she was arrested over a dress. Within 20 years, she controlled assets equivalent to tens of millions in modern currency. She mastered leverage. She transformed patronage into investment. She converted vulnerability into capital. And when the system attempted to claw back what she had gained, she survived the courtroom. Her story disrupts comfortable categories. She was neither purely victim nor purely villain. She was ambitious. She adapted. She exploited blind spots in a society structured against her. When John R. Platt accused her of blackmail, the public's willingness to believe him reflected more about America than about Hannah. The idea that a black woman could independently accumulate wealth threatened social assumptions, so the narrative reframed her success as manipulation. Yet, the courts found no evidence of coercion. The money had been given voluntarily. In the Gilded Age, fortunes were made through industrial consolidation, speculation, and exploitation. Men who amassed millions were celebrated as titans. A woman who amassed wealth through relationships and property investments was suspect. Hannah navigated that hypocrisy with calculation, and then she left. Perhaps departure was the only way to ensure control over her final chapter. By removing herself from American jurisdiction socially and legally, she denied the system another opportunity to define her. There is something powerful in that. No dramatic downfall, no prison sentence, no public ruin, just exit. In the end, Hannah Elias represents a form of economic insurgency within rigid racial and gender structures. She entered New York with nothing. She left it wealthy, and she did so without public apology. History often prefers narratives of tragic downfall or moral redemption. Hannah's life offers neither neatly. Instead, it offers survival calculated, imperfect, controversial survival. She understood desire. She understood capital. She understood timing. And when the spotlight became too hot, she stepped out of it. Her final years may remain blurred by distance, but one truth is clear. She refused to let America have the last word on her. And in a country eager to categorize, that refusal itself was power. Virginia, early 1800s. As the United States entered its early decades of nationhood, new generations grew up learning about the Revolution. They memorized the names: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, Marquis de Lafayette. James Armistead Lafayette's name rarely appeared beside them. History tends to elevate those who command from the front. James had commanded from the margins. After gaining his freedom in 1787, he did not seek public office. He did not write memoirs recounting his espionage. He did not tour cities recounting British strategy meetings or the tension of moving between enemy lines. He farmed. He built a life grounded in land 40 acres that represented stability, autonomy, and dignity. For a formerly enslaved man in early America, land ownership was more than property. It was proof of personhood. Over time, he accumulated enough holdings to be considered prosperous within his community. Census records indicate he was a respected landowner. He qualified for and eventually received a modest pension for his wartime service. Though even that recognition required bureaucratic persistence, his name carried weight locally, but not nationally. The irony deepened as the country expanded westward and intensified debates over slavery. The same nation that owed part of its independence to his intelligence continued to entrench the institution that had once bound him. James lived long enough to witness contradictions harden. He saw the ideals of the Revolution invoked repeatedly, sometimes sincerely, sometimes selectively. He saw the institution of slavery grow stronger in the South, and within that system, he participated in its norms. Records suggest that he owned enslaved individuals later in life. To modern readers, that fact is uncomfortable, even infuriating. But history resists clean moral arcs. For James, ownership may have represented economic survival within a society structured around forced labor. Participation in that system did not erase his own experience of bondage, but it did reveal how deeply embedded slavery was in the fabric of early America. He was not operating in a vacuum of modern ethical frameworks. He was operating in 18th and early 19th century Virginia. This complexity does not diminish his contribution. If anything, It magnifies the tension his life embodies. He infiltrated the British Empire by exploiting racial assumptions. He transmitted intelligence that led directly to the siege of Yorktown. He forced one of the most powerful generals in the world into surrender. And then he had to petition the state to recognize his humanity. That petition, preserved in historical records, stands as quiet testimony. He did not write philosophical essays on liberty. He wrote a request for it. In 1824, when Lafayette returned for his celebrated tour, James's presence at Yorktown served as living evidence of shared history. Though the moment was not immortalized in grand paintings, it represented something profound. The enslaved man who risked death for independence stood free beside the general who trusted him. Two aging men, bound by a secret that reshaped the world. When James died in 1832, at approximately 72 years old, there was no national mourning. No statues were commissioned. His gravesite remains uncertain, a metaphor, perhaps, for how easily essential figures can fade. Yet markers placed centuries later acknowledge his role. Historians have restored his name to the narrative of Yorktown, and in doing so, they complicate the familiar story of the American Revolution. Because independence was not secured solely by speeches in Philadelphia or charges on battlefields, it was secured by information, by deception, by a man who understood how to turn invisibility into advantage. James Armistead, Lafayette's legacy is not one of dramatic hero worship. It is one of strategic impact. He reveals a truth embedded at the core of American history. The nation was shaped not only by those who stood in the spotlight, but by those who moved unseen. And sometimes, the most decisive force in a revolution is the person everyone assumes does not matter. New York City, late 1940s. By the time Belle da Costa Greene approached the end of her career, her name was inseparable from the Morgan Library. Scholars cited her acquisitions. Collectors respected her instincts. New York society considered her a cultural authority. For more than 4 decades, she had shaped one of the most prestigious private collections in the world into a public institution of intellectual power. Outwardly, it was triumph. Inwardly, it was exhaustion. Age and illness crept in slowly. Travel became harder. Auction rooms once energized her. Now they drained her. The pace she had sustained for years, correspondence, negotiations, evaluations, began to slow. But what weighed on her most may not have been physical decline. It was legacy. Belle understood better than anyone the power of documentation. She had built a career organizing manuscripts so that future generations could interpret the past accurately. She knew what records preserved and what records revealed, and she made a deliberate decision. Before her death, she destroyed much of her personal correspondence and private papers. It was not accidental. It was not negligence. It was curation. By eliminating certain documents, she controlled what future historians could access about her inner life. Questions about her racial origins, her private thoughts about passing, her relationship with her father, all were left incomplete. In effect, she edited herself out of full exposure. The irony was staggering. The woman who preserved centuries of European history chose to leave her own partially obscured. Perhaps she feared posthumous scrutiny. Perhaps she believed her work mattered more than her ancestry. Perhaps she wanted the Morgan Library to stand without controversy. Or perhaps she understood that in America, revelation could still reshape reputation. When she retired in 1948, the Morgan Library organized an exhibition honoring her acquisitions. It was meant to celebrate her extraordinary eye, the illuminated manuscripts, rare editions, Renaissance drawings she had secured over decades. She attended in a wheelchair. The image was symbolic. The architect of legacy surrounded by the physical artifacts she had saved from obscurity. But the woman herself remained partly veiled. In 1950, she died of cancer at St. Luke's Hospital in New York. The New York Times obituary praised her brilliance, her sophistication, her contributions to scholarship. It did not mention that she was born Belle Marion Greener. It did not mention Richard T. Greener, Harvard's first black graduate. The silence held. For years after her death, the dominant narrative of Belle da Costa Greene remained intact, a cosmopolitan librarian of Portuguese descent who rose through intelligence and charm to lead a cultural empire. Only later would researchers uncover the fuller story. Birth records, census data, family connections. The pieces came together slowly. And when they did, her life took on a new dimension. Her achievements did not diminish, they intensified, because they revealed the magnitude of what she had navigated. Early 20th century America was not forgiving to Black women in positions of authority within elite white institutions. The barriers were explicit, the social codes rigid. Belle had not simply climbed those barriers. She had moved through them undetected. Her passing was not casual deception. It was strategy within a hostile structure. But strategy carries cost. She distanced herself from her father's public identity. She rarely appeared in Black intellectual spaces. She lived in a world that would have rejected her had it known the full truth. Was that sacrifice worth it? The Morgan Library stands as testament to her impact. Scholars continue to rely on collections she built. Exhibitions still display items she selected. Her legacy is secure, yet it rests upon an edited biography. In destroying her papers, Belle made one final decision. As curator of narrative, she ensured that historians would piece her together from fragments, just as she once pieced together medieval manuscripts from scattered folios. And in that sense, she never relinquished control. Her life embodies one of the sharpest paradoxes in American cultural history. A woman who preserved the past had to obscure her own. She lived between identities, one inherited, one constructed, and in the end, she left behind not confession, but achievement, which may have been the only form of immortality she trusted. France, 1920s, a life unrecorded. By the time Hannah Elias settled somewhere in France, whether Paris or the Riviera, she had already lived several American lifetimes. What she left behind in New York was not poverty. It was narrative. In the United States, her name had been welded to scandal. The press had reduced her to a caricature, the cunning Black woman who drained a wealthy white industrialist. Headlines had been sensational, illustrations exaggerated, language coded with racial suspicion. But in Europe, those headlines meant little. There were no American newspapers waiting at her door, no courtroom reporters documenting her movements, no family of John R. Platt pushing civil claims. She existed likely comfortably outside the jurisdiction of American gossip. The absence of detailed records about her final years is not accidental negligence. It reflects how quickly society moves on once spectacle fades. When she was accused of extortion, she was front-page news. When she was cleared, attention waned. When she left, she ceased to be useful to public drama. And so, she slipped into the margins of documentation. Some accounts claim she lived in Paris. Others suggest she favored the French Riviera, where wealthy expatriates and seasonal elites gathered in villas overlooking the Mediterranean. A few sources place her death sometime in the late 1920s. There is no grand obituary correcting misconceptions, no cultural reevaluation during her lifetime. The absence itself becomes part of her story. Hannah Elias did not die in disgrace. She died most likely in comfort. That matters. Her story is often framed around the lawsuit of 1904, as though the accusation defines her legacy. But to reduce her life to that scandal ignores the scale of her financial acumen. She entered New York with almost nothing. She left it financially secure. She invested in property before Harlem's rise. She converted patronage into passive income. She built stability beyond the lifespan of her relationship with John R. Platt. And when that relationship became weaponized against her, she survived the courtroom intact. In the Gilded Age, men who accumulated wealth through speculation and consolidation were celebrated as captains of industry. Hannah accumulated wealth through relational leverage and strategic property acquisition and was treated as suspect. The contrast reveals more about America's racial and gendered anxieties than about her morality. Her life also exposes how society polices upward mobility differently depending on who is climbing. A white businessman transferring $685,000 voluntarily to a lover might be viewed as foolish. A black woman receiving it must be manipulative. Yet evidence failed to support that narrative. What remains is a figure who understood economics intuitively. She recognized that money in hand could vanish, but money in property could compound. She understood discretion until discretion no longer protected her. And when the spotlight intensified, she chose movement. In many ways, her departure mirrors the logic of her entire life. Adapt, shift, survive. Unlike Belle, who curated her own silence by destroying papers, Hannah's silence resulted from lack of preservation. The system that sensationalized her trial did not care to document her final stability. But silence does not equal failure. Sometimes, it signals control reclaimed. Hannah Elias did not end as a cautionary tale. She ended as an unanswered question. And perhaps that ambiguity is fitting, because she defied simple categories. She was not merely the girl who stole a dress, not merely the woman accused of blackmail, not merely a product of tenderloin vice. She was an investor, a strategist, a survivor of public humiliation who retained her wealth and autonomy. In American memory, she often appears briefly a headline, a scandal, a curiosity, but beneath that thin retelling lies something far more disruptive. A black woman in the late 19th and early 20th century accumulated extraordinary wealth through calculated agency and left the country on her own terms. No apology, no public repentance, no bankruptcy, just departure. History rarely rewards women like Hannah Elias with neat redemption arcs, but perhaps her true legacy is this. She refused to let America define the final chapter of her life. And in a society eager to claim narrative ownership, that refusal remains radical. United States, early 1800s. As decades passed, the revolution transformed from lived experience into legend. Battlefields became monuments. Generals became marble statues. The language of liberty hardened into civic mythology. And James Armistead Lafayette lived long enough to watch memory simplify what had once been messy. By the early 19th century, the United States was expanding westward. Political factions were forming. New conflicts were brewing. The revolution was no longer immediate. It was foundational. But foundations are often described without listing every stone. James continued farming in Virginia. Census records reflect his status as a free black landowner, a category that carried both independence and limitation. Free black communities in the South existed in a precarious balance, legally autonomous, socially restricted, constantly negotiating their position in a slaveholding society. James had achieved something extraordinary in his lifetime. Born enslaved, operated as a spy, granted freedom, owned land. Yet even that arc did not secure him a prominent place in national storytelling. Part of this was structural. Espionage is rarely celebrated in the same way as battlefield heroics. Intelligence work is quiet, classified, deniable. It lacks dramatic spectacle. Another part was racial. Early American historiography centered white leadership. Contributions by black patriots were acknowledged locally, sometimes regionally, but rarely elevated to national prominence. James's name appeared in pension applications and legislative petitions more often than in patriotic speeches. In 1818, Congress passed legislation allowing Revolutionary War veterans to apply for pensions based on financial need. James eventually secured recognition for his service, supported by testimony from those who knew of his espionage work. But the language used in such documents was bureaucratic, stripped of drama. There were no soaring descriptions of infiltration, no narrative accounts of outwitting Cornwallis, just formal acknowledgement. He had done his duty. He had served. He qualified. As he aged, the contradictions of the young republic deepened. The invention of the cotton gin had intensified the profitability of slavery. The institution expanded across southern states. Debates over free and slaved territories began to fracture national politics. James, once enslaved, lived within a society that doubled down on bondage, and he participated economically within that structure. Modern readers struggle with that reality. A man who fought for liberty, later owning slaves. But moral clarity across centuries is difficult. In early 19th century Virginia, landowners, regardless of race, operated within a slave-based agricultural economy. Participation often meant survival and competitiveness. James's ownership of enslaved individuals does not erase his own enslavement. It reveals how pervasive the system was. He did not write treatises condemning slavery. He did not publicly advocate abolition. He lived. He farmed. He raised his family. In 1824, when Lafayette toured America as a celebrated hero, crowds greeted him with parades and speeches. James's reunion with the French general in Virginia was a quieter moment. Two aging men, one aristocrat turned revolutionary, one former slave turned free landowner. Their shared history did not require applause. It required recognition. When James died in 1832, the United States was on the cusp of deeper sectional conflict. The ideals of the Revolution were being reinterpreted, contested, weaponized. He did not live to see the Civil War. He did not live to see emancipation proclaimed nationally. His life spanned a unique arc, from colonial servitude to early Republican independence. And through that arc, he embodied a tension that would define the nation. Liberty proclaimed, liberty delayed, liberty negotiated. His burial site remains uncertain, a symbolic absence. Unlike Washington's Mount Vernon or Jefferson's Monticello, there is no pilgrimage site etched permanently into tourist maps, but historical markers now acknowledge his role. Scholars have restored his name to discussions of Yorktown. Educators increasingly include his espionage work in broader accounts of the Revolution. His story complicates patriotic simplicity. It forces recognition that America's independence was secured not only by famous orators and generals, but by individuals who operated in structural invisibility. James Armistead Lafayette's life is not easily packaged. It contains heroism and contradiction, courage and conformity, radical action and ordinary farming. But perhaps that complexity is the most honest reflection of the nation he helped create. He began life invisible under British and colonial hierarchies. He ended life free, though not fully celebrated. And in between, he demonstrated a quiet truth. Power does not always shout. Sometimes it listens, sometimes it waits, and sometimes it changes history without anyone realizing until much later who was holding the thread. New York City, after 1950, when Belle da Costa Greene died, she left behind an institution stronger than when she found it. But she also left behind a question: who was she really? For years after her death, the dominant version of her life remained polished and uncomplicated. She was remembered as brilliant, cosmopolitan, decisive, the woman who transformed J.P. Morgan's private obsession into one of the world's most respected libraries and museums. The narrative was clean, too clean. It wasn't until decades later that researchers began noticing inconsistencies. Census records, birth certificates. The name Belle Marion Greener surfaced in Washington, D.C. Connections to Richard T. Greener, Harvard's first black graduate, became undeniable. The carefully maintained identity of Belle da Costa Greene, of Portuguese descent, began to fracture. The revelation did not diminish her achievements. It intensified them, because suddenly, her life was not simply a story of cultural leadership, it was a story of navigation through one of America's most rigid racial systems. Passing was not casual. It was not costume. It was risk. Had her background been publicly known in 1905, would J.P. Morgan have hired her? Would elite European dealers have negotiated with her as equal? Would New York society have accepted her bold presence at auctions and galas? History suggests the answer may have been no. Belle had understood the terrain of her era. The early 20th century was not forgiving to Black women in positions of visible authority within white institutions. Social boundaries were explicit. Careers could collapse under exposure, so she made a decision early in life. She would move through doors that were technically closed by altering the label attached to her name. Critics later debated the morality of that choice. Was it betrayal of heritage, or was it a strategic response to structural racism? The truth may resist simple judgment. Belle did not renounce her father publicly, but she distanced herself from his activism. She did not participate visibly in Black intellectual movements of her time. She did not align herself with the Harlem Renaissance, though she lived in New York as it flourished. Instead, she focused on legacy through preservation. The Morgan Library stands today as one of the most significant cultural institutions in the United States. Its medieval manuscripts, Renaissance drawings, and rare books continue to shape scholarship. Every visitor who walks its halls experiences her judgment. Every illuminated manuscript she secured reflects her eye. In curating centuries of European history, she inserted herself into it quietly. And perhaps that was her ultimate strategy. If the world would not easily accept her full identity, she would build something undeniable, something too valuable to erase. The destruction of her personal papers now appears not merely protective, but calculated. She ensured that her work would speak louder than her private complexities. She refused to leave behind confession. She left behind impact. Modern audiences often crave unfiltered transparency from historical figures, but Belle lived in a world where transparency could mean exclusion. Her reinvention was not vanity, it was access, and access allowed her to shape culture at the highest level. Her story challenges simplistic narratives about authenticity. It raises uncomfortable truths about the choices marginalized individuals make to survive and excel within hostile systems. Was she living a lie? Or was she navigating a system built on one? The Morgan Library still carries her imprint. Scholars cite her acquisitions without always remembering the personal negotiation behind them. But the fuller understanding of Belle da Costa Greene transforms her from cultural administrator into something sharper, a strategist of identity. A woman who understood that in America, race could be both barrier and weapon. She did not dismantle the system, she maneuvered within it. And in doing so, she secured a place not only in the institution she built, but in the evolving conversation about power, perception, and survival. Her life does not end with exposure, it expands with it, because once the truth emerged, it became impossible to see her achievements as merely impressive. They became extraordinary. Belle da Costa Greene curated history for the world, and in the process, she curated herself, not as deception, but as design. History has a habit of flattening women like Hannah, Elias. If they are poor, they become cautionary tales. If they are wealthy, they become suspect. If they are controversial, they become footnotes. Hannah became all three, depending on who was telling the story. After she left the United States in 1923, the American press lost interest. There was no courtroom drama to sustain readership, no scandal to monetize. Without conflict, she was no longer profitable as narrative. So she faded, but fading is not the same as failing. By the time she departed for Europe, she had already secured what many in her era could not: economic autonomy. Let's be clear about the scale. The $685,000 at the center of the 1,904 accusation would translate to roughly $30 million today. That kind of capital did not accumulate accidentally. It required sustained financial flow, reinvestment, discipline, and timing. Hannah did not squander her income on spectacle. She bought property. She understood appreciation. She leveraged relationships into long-term assets. Even after the trial, she did not collapse under legal pressure. She retained ownership. She survived civil litigation. She exited the country on her own terms. That exit is often overlooked. Many narratives focus on the accusation, not the outcome. But the outcome is the disruption. She was not convicted. She was not bankrupted. She was not imprisoned. She left wealthy. In American memory, however, her story often lingers in suspicion rather than resolution. The image of the blackmailer lingers longer than the court ruling. That reveals something fundamental about cultural bias. The idea of a black woman independently controlling millions challenged early 20th century expectations. When wealth defies social hierarchy, society searches for corruption to restore order, but courts found none. And Hannah did not remain to rehabilitate her reputation. She did not publish memoirs. She did not conduct interviews clarifying her narrative. She did not attempt to become a socialite patron or philanthropist. She withdrew. In that withdrawal lies a form of defiance. By leaving, she refused to perform redemption for a society that had already judged her. There is something deeply modern about that choice. In an era before social media, before public relations teams, before image management campaigns, Hannah chose silence and relocation. The ambiguity surrounding her final years frustrates historians. Dates blur. Locations vary. Some sources place her death in Paris, others along the French Riviera in the late 1920s. But perhaps that lack of clarity reflects the limits of what America chose to preserve. Society documents spectacle. It rarely documents stability after scandal. Hannah Elias did not end as a tragic figure. She ended as a woman who converted vulnerability into wealth, survived public humiliation, and stepped outside the frame. Her life forces uncomfortable questions. Why is a woman's economic strategy framed differently than a man's? Why does financial agency become suspect when exercised by someone racially marginalized? Why do we remember accusation more vividly than acquittal? She was not perfect. She operated within morally ambiguous spaces. She benefited from relationships rooted in imbalance. But so did many industrial magnates of her time, without being reduced to caricature. Hannah's story reveals the intersection of race, gender, and capital in Gilded Age America. She navigated desire as currency. She understood that men with power often underestimated women without it. She built quietly, and when attacked, she withstood the assault. Her legacy is not etched into monuments. There are no museums bearing her name, but her life disrupts assumptions about who could accumulate wealth and how. She was not merely the girl who stole a dress. She was not merely the defendant in a sensational trial. She was an investor who beat the odds of her era, and she refused to let America script her final act. In that refusal, she joins the ranks of figures history tries to simplify, but cannot fully contain. Hannah Elias remains unresolved, and perhaps that is precisely what makes her unforgettable. By the time James Armistead Lafayette died in 1832, the United States was no longer a fragile experiment. It was expanding, arguing, dividing. The Revolution had become mythology. School children learned about Washington crossing the Delaware, about Paul Revere's ride, about the declaration signed in Philadelphia. Few learned about the enslaved man who sat quietly in British tents, memorizing strategy. James's story exposes something subtle about how nations remember. Visibility determines heroism. Those who speak loudly, who draft documents, who command troops, they are preserved in portraits and statues. Those who operate through listening and deception often vanish between the lines. James had mastered invisibility as strategy. British officers underestimated him because of race. They believed he lacked intellectual capacity. They spoke freely in his presence. He weaponized that assumption. But after the war, invisibility followed him into memory. He did not publish a memoir. He did not demand public acknowledgement. His freedom petition survives in archives, a document more bureaucratic than triumphant. He became a landowner, a farmer, a father. He participated in the economy of his time, including slaveholding, revealing how deeply embedded that system was in early American life. This complexity unsettles modern audiences. We prefer clear heroes, but James was not carved from marble. He was shaped by contradiction. He risked execution for a revolution that delayed his own freedom. He fought for liberty and later operated within a society still structured by bondage. His life is not an uncomplicated morality play. It is a case study in structural tension. Consider the magnitude of his contribution. In August 1781, when Cornwallis planned his movement to Yorktown, secrecy was critical. If the British position had remained fortified and reinforced by sea, the war might have stretched longer, perhaps with different terms at its conclusion. James carried intelligence that enabled the French blockade of the Chesapeake. That blockade sealed Cornwallis's fate. Without it, Yorktown could have unfolded differently. The war's momentum hinged on information, and information hinged on a man others dismissed. There is something deeply American about that irony. A nation founded on ideals of equality secured independence partly through the actions of a man denied equality. James's life also reframes the meaning of patriotism. He was offered freedom by the British in 1775. Lord Dunmore's proclamation promised emancipation to enslaved people who joined the crown. He could have defected permanently. Instead, he aligned with the Continental Army, not because it guaranteed liberty, but because he trusted individuals within it. He trusted Lafayette. That decision was not inevitable. It was personal. Trust over certainty. After emancipation, he remained in Virginia rather than relocate north. That choice reflects attachment to land, family, familiarity, even within contradiction. When he met Lafayette again in 1824, decades after their covert partnership, it symbolized something rare: recognition across hierarchy, not master and servant, not general and spy, but two men bound by shared history. His grave remains uncertain. Perhaps that absence is fitting. He spent much of his life unseen, but the consequences of his actions were enormous. Today, historians increasingly restore his name to revolutionary narratives. Educational curricula expand to include Black patriots whose contributions were once minimized. James Armistead Lafayette becomes more visible with each retelling. Yet his life resists simplification. He is neither sanitized hero nor cautionary contradiction. He is evidence that revolutions are built not only on ideals, but on human complexity. His story forces a re-examination of the American founding, not as pure triumph, not as pure hypocrisy, but as layered, imperfect, shaped by individuals navigating systems larger than themselves. James did not write the Declaration. He did not command troops into battle. He listened. He observed. He transmitted truth strategically, and in doing so, he shifted the balance of a war. Perhaps that is his enduring lesson. Power does not always reside with those who appear powerful. Sometimes it resides with those who understand how to move unseen. James Armistead Lafayette began life invisible. he ended it free. And between those two realities, he altered the trajectory of a nation that would take centuries to fully reckon with the contradictions he embodied. For most of the 20th century, Belle da Costa Greene's story was told in polished tones. She was described as brilliant, cultured, commanding, the indispensable librarian who elevated the Morgan Library into a world-class institution. But something was always missing. The reveal did not happen during her lifetime. It happened quietly. In archives, historians began to trace inconsistencies in her background. Census records from Washington, D.C., birth certificates. The name Belle Marion Greener appeared in connection with Richard T. Greener, Harvard's first black graduate. The facade cracked. Belle da Costa Greene, the supposed Portuguese socialite, had been born into one of America's most prominent black intellectual families. The discovery reframed everything: her education, her access to Princeton, her hiring by J.P. Morgan, her authority in elite white circles. It was no longer simply impressive, it was audacious. To understand the magnitude, we must return to early 20th century America. Segregation was not abstract, it was codified. Social boundaries were enforced with quiet brutality. A black woman, openly occupying the role Belle held, controlling millions in cultural acquisitions, negotiating with European aristocrats, would have faced systemic resistance at every level. Her passing was not cosmetic, it was strategic architecture. And the system she navigated allowed it because it never imagined someone like her could exist in that position. That's the tension. She did not dismantle the racial hierarchy of her time. She slipped through it. For some, this raises ethical discomfort. Should she have declared her identity proudly? Should she have aligned publicly with black intellectual movements? Those questions are shaped by modern expectations. Belle lived in a world where exposure could mean exclusion. She chose access. Access gave her power. Power allowed her to shape culture. Without that access, the Morgan Library would not look as it does today. Her decision complicates the concept of authenticity. We often assume authenticity requires transparency, but for marginalized individuals in hostile systems, authenticity can require strategy. Belle did not publicly celebrate her father's legacy, yet she carried his intellectual discipline. She embodied his commitment to scholarship. She extended the Greener family's legacy just under a different name. In destroying her personal papers before death, she made one final curatorial decision. She prevented future generations from dissecting her private conflicts too neatly. No diary entries explaining the emotional cost of passing. No confessional letters revealing doubt. She left achievement instead of explanation. When the truth surfaced decades later, it did not topple her legacy. It deepened it. Because now, every manuscript she acquired, every auction she dominated, every negotiation she won, carried an added dimension. She had done it while navigating one of America's most unforgiving racial structures. Not loudly, not defiantly, but effectively. Today, the Morgan Library stands in Manhattan as a monument to preservation. Visitors admire illuminated Bibles, Renaissance drawings, and rare editions. Few realize that the institution's intellectual DNA was shaped by a woman whose own biography required concealment to flourish. Her story forces uncomfortable reflection. How many contributions in American history required silence to succeed? How many doors opened only because identity was obscured? How many institutions were built by people who could not fully inhabit their truth within them? Belle da Costa Greene did not become a symbol during her lifetime. She became one afterward, not as a martyr, not as a revolutionary, but as evidence of how power can be navigated from within. Her life was not loud resistance. It was calculated endurance. And in that endurance, she achieved something extraordinary. She preserved centuries of European history and ensured that her own, however complicated, would not be erased. Even if it had to be rediscovered, history does not just record events. It selects tone. When Hannah Elias appears in historical summaries, she is often introduced through the lawsuit, the accusation of blackmail, the staggering sum of money, the sensational headlines. The framing rarely begins with her investments, rarely with her property strategy, rarely with her acquittal. It begins with suspicion. That pattern reveals more about American memory than about Hannah herself. The early 1900s were saturated with moral panic around race and sexuality. Newspapers thrived on narratives of transgression. A wealthy white industrialist, entangled with a mysterious black woman, was not just news. It was spectacle. The press did not simply report. It dramatized. Illustrations exaggerated her features. Articles questioned her true origins. Reporters speculated about manipulation and deceit long before evidence was evaluated. And when the criminal charges collapsed, the correction did not travel as far as the accusation. This imbalance is critical. Public memory often preserves scandal more vividly than resolution. Hannah won in court, but culturally, the stain lingered. Because her story unsettled social hierarchies. A black woman accumulating wealth equivalent to tens of millions in modern value disrupted expectations. Wealth signified power. Power was not supposed to concentrate in her hands, so the narrative sought to reframe her wealth as theft. Yet documentation showed consistent voluntary transfers from John R. Platt over years. There were no extortion letters, no threats, no coercive evidence. The system tried to recategorize her success as criminal. It failed legally, but socially, doubt remained. And doubt is powerful. After leaving America, Hannah slipped beyond the reach of that doubt. Europe offered distance, geographic and psychological. In Paris, during the 1920s, racial identity functioned differently than in the United States. African American artists found creative freedom there. Black expatriates described feeling less constrained. Whether Hannah engaged with those circles is unclear, but she lived outside the American gaze. In many ways, that departure was her final assertion of control. She did not stay to rehabilitate her image. She did not perform redemption. She exited. Her story complicates how we measure legacy. She did not found an institution like Belle. She did not contribute to a revolution like James. Her battlefield was economic and social. She navigated gendered power dynamics. She converted intimacy into capital. She leveraged property markets before Harlem's explosive growth. She survived one of the most public financial accusations of her era, and she retained autonomy. There is something unsettling about that. Society prefers narratives where controversial women fall dramatically or redeem themselves visibly. Hannah did neither. She endured, then disappeared. Her disappearance is not defeat. It is refusal. Refusal to be endlessly consumed as spectacle. Refusal to remain in a society that defined her through suspicion. Her story also forces a reevaluation of how wealth is morally categorized. Industrial magnates built fortunes through consolidation, speculation, and sometimes exploitation. They were celebrated as builders of America. Hannah built wealth through personal leverage and strategic reinvestment, and was scrutinized as manipulative. The difference lies less in action than in identity. She exploited opportunity. So did the titans of her era. The difference was who was permitted to be ambitious without being criminalized. Hannah Elias remains historically underexamined because her narrative is uncomfortable. It does not align neatly with heroic resistance or tragic victimhood. It presents a woman who operated within morally gray territory and emerged financially intact. In that ambiguity lies her significance. She disrupts the assumption that Black women of the Gilded Age were confined solely to poverty or invisibility. She accumulated capital at scale. She survived public humiliation. She left on her own terms. America remembered the scandal, But perhaps the more radical memory is this: she was not destroyed by it, and that survival, quiet and unresolved, is its own kind of victory. When Americans speak of the Revolution, they often speak in absolutes: freedom, independence, liberty. But James Armistead Lafayette's life resists absolutes. It lives in contradiction. He was born enslaved under British colonial rule. He fought to secure American independence. He remained enslaved after that independence was won. Only later did freedom arrive, not as reward, but as petition. His life forces an uncomfortable re-examination of revolutionary mythology. The American Revolution was framed as a moral uprising against tyranny. Colonists rejected taxation without representation. They demanded self-governance. They declared universal rights. Yet those declarations coexisted with chattel slavery. James understood that contradiction intimately. When Lord Dunmore offered emancipation to enslaved people who joined British forces in 1775, thousands accepted. For many, the crown represented immediate liberation compared to colonial hypocrisy. James could have done the same. Instead, he chose to work with the Continental Army. That choice is often romanticized, but it was strategic. He trusted Marquis de Lafayette. He calculated that his role as a double agent might produce longer-term opportunity. He leveraged his literacy and intelligence as tools. He was not driven by blind patriotism. He was driven by agency. His espionage during the Yorktown campaign was decisive because it exploited racial arrogance. British officers underestimated him. They believed he lacked strategic awareness. That assumption allowed him proximity to power. He listened. He memorized. He transmitted. The Chesapeake blockade that sealed Cornwallis's fate depended on accurate intelligence. Without it, the British might have reinforced their position. James altered that trajectory. And yet, after the surrender at Yorktown, his legal status did not change automatically. He had to request recognition. The state compensated his former master for loss of property. Even freedom required transaction. This tension between revolutionary ideals and lived reality mirrors the broader trajectory of American history. The nation proclaimed equality while codifying exclusion. James's life embodies that paradox without simplification. He did not become an abolitionist icon. He did not lead reform movements. He farmed land. He raised a family. He participated in the economic norms of Virginia, including slaveholding. To modern audiences, that participation complicates his image, but it also underscores how deeply slavery was woven into early American life. No one operated outside the system entirely. James's significance does not lie in moral purity. It lies in impact. He demonstrated that intelligence works subtle, patient, strategic, and redirect empires. He proved that invisibility, when weaponized, can destabilize power. He revealed that those dismissed as marginal can become pivotal. And perhaps most importantly, his life forces us to reconsider how we define patriotism. Is patriotism loud speeches and battlefield glory? Or is it calculated risk taken without guarantee of recognition? James risked execution without assurance of emancipation. That risk was personal. The revolution succeeded. His freedom lagged. He lived long enough to see the nation expand and to see slavery intensify before it would eventually fracture the country in civil war. Decades after his death, he did not witness emancipation nationwide, but he embodied its possibility. Today, historical markers and scholarship increasingly restore his name to the Yorktown narrative. His invisibility is fading, yet his story resists becoming simple inspiration. It remains layered. It asks readers to hold two truths at once. He helped secure American liberty. He lived within a nation that denied it fully. That tension is not accidental. It is foundational. James Armistead Lafayette stands as a reminder that revolutions are rarely clean. They are built on contradictions. They depend on people who may never see full justice in their lifetime. And sometimes, the quietest participant in a war is the one who changes its outcome most profoundly. Long after Belle da Costa Greene's death, visitors continued walking through the Morgan Library without realizing they were stepping into her mind. Every display case, every manuscript selection, every architectural expansion, they reflected her judgment. And yet, for decades, her story was told without its most radical dimension. The version preserved publicly was elegant and uncomplicated, the refined librarian of Portuguese descent who rose through intelligence and charm. That version was comfortable, the fuller truth was disruptive. When historians pieced together her origins, Washington D.C., daughter of Richard T. Greener, they did not just add a biographical detail, they altered the framework. Because Belle's career was not simply a tale of professional excellence, it was a study in navigation through racial architecture. Passing was not accidental camouflage. It was structural strategy. Early 20th century America did not offer Black women leadership roles inside elite white institutions at the level Belle occupied. The Morgan Library was not merely cultural, it was symbolic power. It represented lineage, wealth, and authority. Belle's presence in that space, had her identity been known, would have challenged social codes directly. Instead, she moved within those codes. This raises difficult questions that resist moral absolutism. Did she benefit from racial concealment? Did that concealment reinforce the very system that necessitated it? Perhaps, but it also allowed her to occupy and shape spaces otherwise inaccessible. Without Belle, the Morgan Library's acquisitions might have followed different priorities. Different manuscripts might have been preserved. Different narratives might have dominated its collection. Her influence is embedded in scholarship to this day. And yet, she rarely spoke publicly about race. She did not attach herself to civil rights movements of her era. She did not write essays reflecting on identity. Her silence has been interpreted variously as survival, as compromise, as pragmatism. What is undeniable is that she understood power intimately. Power is not only about dominance, it is about access. Access to rooms where decisions are made, access to resources, access to permanence. Belle secured access and used it to build something lasting. When she destroyed her personal correspondence, she made one final assertion of agency. She refused to allow future generations to mine her private life for confession or regret. She left scholars with institutional records, acquisitions, letters about manuscripts, professional documents. She withheld the interior. In doing so, she forced history to reconstruct her from fragments. That reconstruction has shifted how we understand not just her, but the broader American cultural landscape. Her story challenges simplistic narratives of resistance. Not all resistance is loud. Not all change arrives through public declaration. Sometimes, it arrives through quiet occupation of space. Belle did not storm the gates. She walked through them, and once inside, she rearranged the furniture. Her legacy forces modern audiences to confront uncomfortable realities. How many talented individuals historically altered their identities to survive? How many institutions owe their excellence to people who could not fully reveal themselves within them? How many achievements were made possible only through strategic silence? The Morgan Library stands intact. Its collections remain extraordinary, and its foundation bears the imprint of a woman who mastered the art of perception. Belle da Costa Greene curated the past for future generations, and in doing so, she curated herself not to deceive, but to endure. Her story is no longer hidden, but its complexity remains. And that complexity may be the most honest tribute to a life lived between worlds, navigating power with precision, building legacy with discipline, and leaving behind an institution too significant to ignore. even if parts of her story had to be rediscovered. If Belle's life was carefully curated, Hannah Elias's life was carelessly simplified. That difference matters. Belle built an institution. James helped build a nation. Hannah built wealth, and that unsettled people. When historians revisit her story, they often begin with the scandal of 1904, the lawsuit, the accusation of extortion, the staggering figure, $685,000. But rarely do they begin with the outcome. No conviction, no prison sentence, no forced restitution. The courts did not validate John R. Platt's narrative. Yet culturally, suspicion lingered. This pattern reflects something deeper in American memory. Women who accumulate power through unconventional routes are more easily recast as villains. Industrialists consolidated railroads, steel, oil, often through ruthless tactics, and were memorialized as captains of industry. Hannah leveraged intimacy into capital and was memorialized as scandal. The moral framing reveals bias. She entered New York society from below. She lacked inherited wealth, elite education, or institutional backing. She understood that proximity to power could become leverage, and she converted that leverage into property. Property meant rental income. Rental income meant independence. Independence meant insulation. By the early 1900s, she was insulated enough to survive a public attack. The lawsuit was not just about money, it was about control. Platt's family, upon discovering the scale of transfers, feared depletion of inheritance. The accusation reframed voluntary payments as coercion. It was an attempt to reassert hierarchy, but courts demand evidence, and evidence failed. Hannah's wealth remained. Still, the social consequences were real. Reputation operates differently than legality. Even acquitted individuals can remain socially suspect, so she chose departure. That departure disrupts the expected narrative arc. She did not collapse into disgrace. She did not cling to American society seeking acceptance. She left. In Europe, particularly in the 1920s, Black Americans often described experiencing greater social mobility. Paris, in particular, became a haven for artists and expatriates. Hannah's presence there, though sparsely documented, suggests she sought not spectacle but distance. Distance from headlines, distance from racialized narratives, distance from a country that tried to recategorize her success as criminal. The scarcity of records about her final years frustrates historians, but perhaps it reveals something else. She was no longer useful to scandal, and so she was not preserved. History often documents spectacle more thoroughly than stability. If Hannah had fallen dramatically bankrupt, imprisoned, disgraced, the archives might overflow with documentation. But she stabilized, and stabilization is less sensational. Her story forces us to examine how wealth intersects with race and gender in American memory. Why is ambition admirable in some figures and suspicious in others? Why does economic success demand moral justification when achieved outside accepted channels? Hannah Elias does not fit neatly into heroic narratives. She did not campaign for reform. She did not attach herself to movements. She did not leave behind public philanthropy. She accumulated. She endured. She exited. Her life exists in the gray spaces of American capitalism, where opportunity and inequality intertwine. And perhaps that gray space is precisely why she unsettles. She was not destroyed by scandal. She was not redeemed by society. She remained complex. In many ways, her legacy is not about romance or courtroom drama. It is about control. Control over her finances, control over her movement, control over her final chapter. While America remembered the accusation, it largely forgot the acquittal. But history, when revisited carefully, tells a different story. It tells of a woman who entered one of the most rigid social hierarchies of her era and extracted wealth from it. And when that hierarchy tried to reassert dominance, She refused to remain within its frame. She stepped beyond it. Hannah Elias may not have left monuments, but she left disruption. And sometimes, disruption is the most enduring legacy of all. As America matured, it polished its origin story. The revolution became a clean narrative: brave patriots, tyrannical empire, righteous victory. But James Armistead Lafayette never fit cleanly into that polish. He was a patriot, but not the kind cast in bronze. He did not sign documents. He did not lead battalions. He did not draft philosophical arguments about liberty. He infiltrated. He listened. He lied convincingly to British officers who underestimated him. That alone complicates the mythology. Espionage requires deception. It requires ambiguity. It is not heroic in the theatrical sense. It is strategic in the invisible sense. James's patriotism was practical, not rhetorical. He chose the continental cause, even though it offered him no immediate guarantee of freedom. He operated without written protection. If discovered, he would have been executed not merely as a runaway slave, but as a spy. And yet, after victory, he returned to enslavement. This is the tension historians cannot smooth over. The American Revolution expanded political liberty for colonists, while preserving bondage for hundreds of thousands of enslaved people. James embodied that contradiction. His freedom required a petition to the Virginia legislature. It required endorsement from Marquis de Lafayette. It required compensation to his former master. Freedom was negotiated. That reality reframes how we understand revolutionary triumph. Liberty was not universally distributed. It was selectively granted. James eventually secured land, stability, and recognition through pension legislation. He lived long enough to see the young republic stabilize politically and fracture morally. He saw debates over slavery intensify. He saw expansion westward entrench the institution further. He did not live to see the Civil War, but his life foreshadowed it, because embedded in his story is the unresolved question at the heart of America's founding: who qualifies as fully human under the language of equality? James's later participation in slaveholding complicates the narrative further. Modern readers recoil at the idea that a formerly enslaved man would own slaves, but early 19th century Virginia was structured around agricultural labor systems that left few alternatives for landowners seeking economic viability. This does not absolve, it contextualizes. James was not outside his time. He was inside it, shaped by it, constrained by it. His heroism does not rest in moral perfection. It rests in strategic impact. Without his intelligence during the Yorktown campaign, British troop movements might have unfolded differently. Without accurate information reaching Lafayette, the French blockade might have failed. Yorktown was decisive. James was decisive to Yorktown. And yet, his name rarely appears alongside Washington's or Jefferson's in popular memory. This omission reveals something about how nations remember. Heroism is often assigned to those who symbolize aspiration. James symbolizes contradiction. He forces acknowledgement that the revolution's promise and its limitations were simultaneous. He stands as proof that marginalized individuals shaped foundational events, even while excluded from their full benefits. Today, historical scholarship has begun restoring his visibility. Educational curricula increasingly include Black patriots. Monuments and markers acknowledge his espionage work, but recognition remains partial. Perhaps that is fitting. James Armistead Lafayette does not lend himself to simple inspiration posters. He represents complexity. He represents the uncomfortable truth that freedom can be proclaimed while withheld. He represents the power of intelligence over spectacle, and he represents the countless individuals whose contributions were essential but uncelebrated. If the American Revolution is a story about liberty, then James is one of its most revealing characters, because he demonstrates that liberty was never abstract. It was personal. It was delayed. It was negotiated, and for some, it required risking everything before being granted at all. He did not fit the polished narrative, but perhaps that is precisely why he belongs at its center. In the end, Belle da Costa Greene achieved something rare. She did not merely participate in history, she positioned herself inside its architecture. When we look at the Morgan Library today, the illuminated manuscripts glowing under glass, the Renaissance drawings preserved in climate-controlled rooms, the rare first editions that scholars still study, we are looking at decisions she made. She shaped what future generations would have access to. That alone secures her legacy. But the final chapter of her story carries a sharper edge. Belle did not just curate manuscripts. She curated perception. In early 20th century America, race functioned as gatekeeper. Doors to elite institutions were not just closed. They were guarded by social codes, pedigree expectations, and quiet prejudice. Belle understood that. She did not protest publicly. She did not demand inclusion. She entered anyway. And once inside, she became indispensable. That is the brilliance of her strategy. If she had been easily replaceable, exposure might have destroyed her position. But by the time her authority was cemented, the institution relied on her expertise. Her value outweighed scrutiny. And so, the scrutiny never came. After her death in 1950, the official narrative of her life remained intact for decades. She was remembered as refined, cosmopolitan, formidable. Her racial origins were not part of the story. When researchers later uncovered the truth, Washington, D.C., Richard T. Greener, the shift from greener to green, the adoption of da Costa, it did not undo her accomplishments. It reframed them. Her passing was not about self-rejection. It was about structural navigation. She maneuvered within a system that would have denied her authority had she been transparent. And in doing so, she built something that could not easily be erased. Her destruction of personal papers before death now reads as one final editorial act. She refused to allow history to dissect her interior life in ways that might reduce her to controversy. She left work, she left impact, she left permanence. The tension in her story does not dissolve neatly. Was she complicit in maintaining racial silence within elite institutions? Or was she carving out space where none was offered? Perhaps both, but history rarely advances through purity alone. Sometimes it advances through individuals who understand how to move within constraints. Belle da Costa Greene did not become a symbol during her lifetime. She became something subtler, a proof of concept, proof that intellectual authority could be claimed, even if identity had to be recalibrated to claim it, proof that institutions often rest on labor and brilliance that remain partially hidden, proof that legacy can outlast secrecy. Today, her story invites reconsideration of how we define authenticity, courage, and resistance. Not all resistance announces itself. Not all power shouts. Sometimes, power rearranges the room quietly, and by the time anyone notices, the architecture has changed. Belle did not just survive the system of her era, she mastered it, and in mastering it, she ensured that her influence would echo far beyond the name she chose to carry. She edited herself into history, and history, eventually, revealed the full text. But by then, the foundation she built was already unshakable. If Belle's story ends with revelation, Hannah Elias's ends with disappearance. And that disappearance may be the most powerful statement she ever made. By the time she boarded a ship for Europe in 1923, she had already endured the spectacle. The courtroom, the headlines, the caricatures, the whispered questions about her race, her morality, her legitimacy. America had taken its turn with her story, and she declined to give it another. There is something deeply subversive about that. Hannah did not remain in New York to rehabilitate her image. She did not attempt to rebrand herself through philanthropy. She did not publish her version of events. She left. In a society that tried to define her as manipulator or criminal, she reclaimed the only thing still fully hers: movement. Her wealth allowed that movement, and that wealth had been built carefully through property, reinvestment, and disciplined financial management. When people recount her life, they often fixate on the number, $685,000. But numbers only shock because of context. The real story is not the amount, it is how she secured it consistently, over time, without evidence of coercion. John R. Platt's accusation framed the money as theft. The courts disagreed, yet public memory clung to suspicion because Hannah disrupted hierarchy. A black woman, once imprisoned for a stolen dress, accumulating wealth that rivaled industrial fortunes, that narrative destabilized expectations. It was easier to call her dangerous than competent, easier to call her manipulative than strategic. But when the legal system failed to confirm that suspicion, she was left in a peculiar position, acquitted, but marked. That mark likely influenced her decision to leave. In Europe, especially in 1920s Paris, Black Americans often found different social dynamics. Artists, musicians, and intellectuals described a sense of breathing space absent in the United States. Whether Hannah engaged with those communities remains uncertain, but her relocation removed her from the American lens that had distorted her image. She did not return. Her final years are sparsely documented. The record thins. Dates blur. She likely died in the late 1920s, in relative comfort. No American monument commemorates her. No institution bears her name. But perhaps that absence reflects discomfort more than insignificance. Hannah Elias complicates moral storytelling. She was not a reformer. She was not a martyr. She was not purely victim or purely villain. She was ambitious. She was calculating. She understood the economics of desire, and she converted proximity into permanence. Her story challenges the assumption that Black women in the Gilded Age were confined solely to domestic labor or invisibility. She was neither invisible nor domesticated. She was financially formidable, and when the system attempted to discipline her through public humiliation, she outlasted it. Her final act departure reads almost like punctuation, a period placed deliberately at the end of a sentence others tried to keep revising. America wanted her to remain within its narrative of scandal. She declined. In doing so, she left behind something rarer than vindication. She left ambiguity, and ambiguity resists control. Hannah Elias did not allow herself to be reduced to the trial. She did not allow accusation to become destiny. She exited wealthy, autonomous, and unrepentant. History may struggle to categorize her, but perhaps that is precisely her legacy. She refused categorization, and in a society obsessed with defining women like her, that refusal was its own quiet revolution. When we reach the end of James Armistead Lafayette's story, there is no dramatic crescendo, no battlefield charge, no speech delivered to crowds, no monument unveiled in his honor. There is simply a life lived fully, imperfectly, and in tension with the nation he helped create. He began as property. That fact alone should never be softened. He was born into a system that measured his value in labor and obedience. His name at birth did not carry agency. It carried ownership, and yet, during the revolution, he chose to risk everything, not because the new nation guaranteed him equality, but because he saw opportunity within uncertainty. His espionage work at Yorktown did not just assist American forces, it reshaped momentum. Intelligence is often the hinge on which wars turn. James became that hinge. He manipulated perception. British officers saw a runaway slave. Lafayette saw an operative. History saw eventually a catalyst. But recognition came slowly. His freedom required paperwork. His humanity required endorsement. Even his later pension required proof. That layered process reveals something essential about early America. Liberty was not self-executing. It had to be demanded. And even then, it could be delayed. James lived long enough to experience that delay and its aftermath. He farmed land that once would have been denied to him. He built a family structure under legal autonomy. He navigated a society that still restricted Black movement and opportunity. He also participated in the economic structure of his region, including slaveholding, exposing the deep entanglement of survival and system. That complexity does not dilute his earlier courage. It underscores the contradictions of his era. James did not exist outside American history. He existed inside its fractures. His life reveals a truth often blurred in patriotic storytelling. Revolutions are not singular events. They are beginnings. The Revolution secured independence from Britain. It did not secure equality for all. James's life stretched across that gap. He embodied both the promise and the limitation of American liberty. He helped defeat an empire, and then had to petition his own state for recognition. He stood at Yorktown twice in his lifetime, once in secrecy, once in reunion with Lafayette. The first time, he operated unseen. The second time, he stood, acknowledged. That arc matters because it demonstrates that invisibility is not destiny. It can be strategic. It can be temporary, but it leaves a mark. Today, as historians restore his name to textbooks and plaques, his story complicates the founding narrative of the United States in necessary ways. He forces us to confront that independence was not equally distributed. He reminds us that marginalized individuals shaped foundational victories, and he demonstrates that patriotism can exist even when the nation does not fully reciprocate. James Armistead Lafayette's life does not offer a simple moral. It offers a mirror reflecting the contradictions embedded at the birth of a country that proclaimed universal rights while withholding them. He was not the loudest voice of the revolution. He was not its most celebrated face, but he was essential. And perhaps that is the final lesson threaded through all three lives in this story. Belle, Hannah, James. History is not only shaped by those who stand at podiums. It is shaped by those who navigate structures quietly, by those who leverage perception, by those who move when necessary. James moved between enemy lines. Belle moved between identities. Hannah moved between continents. Each, in their own way, altered the space around them, not always celebrated, not always fully understood.